Good afternoon. The Senate Judiciary Public Safety Committee will come together. Sorry about the delay here. It's budget season and things are running a little bit behind schedule. We're going to take up, let's see, today is March 21st, 22nd. Thank you. I'm looking for my agenda here. 2023. We do have a quorum present. We're going to take up Senate File 1384 first. Senator McEwen, come on forward. Thank you, Senator McEwen, and people interested in this bill. We've been sort of assembling the testimony in this over the course of several hearings. We laid it on the table last time to make sure that the associated builders and contractors had an opportunity to present their position with regard to the testimony from the commissioner that we heard last time. We're not going to repeat that. Members, in your packets, there is correspondence from the building contractors, or builders and contractors, for your review. There's also a letter from Minnesota Department of Labor and Industry, which was included in the packet on Monday, but you have it again for your information. So at this point, I don't see a need to take any further testimony. We can open the floor for comments or discussions from members of the committee. All right. Senator Limmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since the time we met last, I believe at our previous meeting, the Associated Builders and Contractors made comments. Just wanted to know, now that these positions are known, has there been any alteration to the bill as a result of any discussion, or has there been discussion between proponents and opponents since our previous meeting?
Senator McEwen.
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chair. Senator Limmer, I have not been approached by ABC to make any changes since the last hearing.
All right. Thank you.
All right, not seeing any further discussion, Senator Umuver-Bate moves that Senate File 1384 be recommended to pass and be re-referred to the Committee on Labor. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion prevails.
Thank you.
All right, next item, Senate File 2914, Senator Westland. Members, the packet is being distributed to you bill by bill here. Senator Westland, this is your bill. This is the first committee. We have an A1 amendment in the packet. Senator Westland moves adoption of the A1 amendment as an author's amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion prevails. Amendment's adopted. Senator Westland, to your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We do have County Attorney Choi also on Zoom, so we will have testimony from County Attorney Mary Moriarty and also County Attorney Choi. The purpose of this bill is to provide a grant for caseload backlog and innovation to try to help our county attorneys deal with the backlogs that have accumulated. The grants would be administered through the Office of Justice Programs, and again, it would be funding initiatives specifically to decrease criminal case backlogs, reduce recidivism, reduce future criminal caseloads, and so forth. And then the amendment adds some additional information that the grants could be used to coordinate prosecution and law enforcement investigations to improve clearance rates specifically for violent crimes. So I would actually turn it over to our experts at this point. I know County Attorney Choi is on a time frame, so perhaps we can allow him to testify first, Mr. Chair.
County Attorney Choi, welcome back to the Judiciary Committee. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to begin my remarks by first, I've never had a chance to actually meet Senator Westland, but I want to really thank you for bringing this bill forward to think about and have the legislature think about how they could help prosecutors deal with the enormous backlogs that we have. And then also, I very much appreciate the A1 amendment, which is really where my passion lies in terms of hoping to get some funding and assistance from the legislature. The A1 amendment especially is something that I am very passionate about. I think there has been a lot of discussion in the course of the past year or two about all of the things that we could maybe be doing better in the criminal justice system. And I will be the first to tell you that we can be doing a lot of better things in our office, in the courts, but also with policing, all of those things. There's a lot of things that we can do, I think, to address some of the things that we have been experiencing that we have not experienced before for quite some time, about the uptick in violence and the things that are happening. But I think one of the most important things, and I've said this to this committee before, is nothing will change unless we actually start working together and we help each other address the challenges that we have and recognize where we can actually pull together in the same direction and start making some good, positive changes. One particular area that I see as it relates to helping prosecutor offices address some of the backlog issues, but also some of the violent crime. And that's why I very much appreciate the A1 amendment. And this is the reason our office would be very interested in this bill, is that we don't talk enough about the cases that go unsolved or where we don't have the resources to actually do the investigation. I'll be the first to tell you that across this country, the solve and clearance rates for many of the most important crimes that we need to be paying attention to, the violent crime that involves guns, the clearance rates on those crimes, and for those of you who don't understand what a clearance rate might be, it's when an incident happens and police investigate, and whether or not we can actually identify a suspect and present something to the county attorney for a potential prosecution review. But the clearance rate for many of the violent crimes is well under 50% in this country. In my jurisdiction in Ramsey County, the clearance rate on non-fatal shootings, so I'm talking about bullet to skin cases where someone has been shot and the police officer or the investigator will go to the hospital and ask the person who has been shot, who shot you? In those types of cases, the clearance rate in Ramsey County is 35%. I, as a prosecutor in my office, cannot do anything unless we can identify a suspect and do that investigation so that we can take action. It's a horrible message when we don't have accountability in some of the most violent crimes. Now, I'm very proud of the fact that in Ramsey County and in St. Paul, we have a clearance rate for homicides that's about 87%. In fact, it's one of the tops in the nation. And when I go around the country and tell people about that, a lot of people don't believe that number because it's so high. But we have a lot of work to do in Ramsey County around the clearance rates of non-fatal shootings. And I believe that this opportunity, and if legislature could provide some funding, grant funding, working together with law enforcement. Every chief, by the way, is in support of, in my jurisdiction, of this initiative. We also have in the hearing room, I believe, Commander Rich Altieri from the Ramsey County Sheriff's Office, who is on loan to my office, who's coordinating a plan to coordinate law enforcement agencies to improve that clearance rate. We want to go from 35% to over 50%. And I think that's a really important thing. So anything that the legislature can do to help our office invest in the resources that are necessary and also to support investigators in our jurisdictions, in my jurisdiction, would be very much appreciated. And I think it really can make a difference. So with that, I'll conclude my remarks. And I want to thank you, Senator Latz, and members of the committee for your interest.
Thank you, County Attorney Choi. We also have with us the newly elected County Attorney from Hennepin County, Mary Moriarty. Welcome to your first Judiciary Committee hearing.
Thank you, Senator Latz and committee members. I won't repeat what County Attorney Choi said, but one of our priorities is violent crime and sexual assault. And one of the things that we are working very hard on is to develop relationships with our law enforcement partners throughout Hennepin County. And part of that is outreach to them about how to be proactive investigating sexual assault cases and other violent crimes so that we can work together to build the best case possible. So to give you an example, what is proactive partnering with law enforcement in the county attorney's office? What does that look like? You remember the cases, and these were highly publicized, where people in downtown Minneapolis who were coming out of bars, who were looking at their phones, were being assaulted, attacked, and their phones were being stolen. We were getting many of those cases, and it was proactive work by our office with law enforcement where we were able to develop with law enforcement that this was a ring of people that were attacking vulnerable people and using their phones and sending the phones off to a foreign country. It's elaborate. It took a lot of work on our part and the part of law enforcement to crack this ring and realize that these were not just individual robbers. They were specifically targeting people, and we were able, with the help of law enforcement, to break that ring. That is what proactive relationships with county attorneys and law enforcement can do. We know deterrence is really dependent on the certainty of whether somebody's actually going to be held accountable or actually charged. When we don't have the clearance rates, as County Attorney Choi said, we lose the opportunity to send a message to people in the community that they will be caught. There will be accountability. So to the extent that we can have these resources to be able to work on our backlog to be more proactive with our law enforcement partners, we will be able to create a much safer community. Thank you.
Thank you, County Attorney Moriarty. Members, the plan is to lay the bill over for possible inclusion in the budget bill. So we'll open up the floor to questions or comments from members of the committee. Senator Limmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Did we adopt the A1 amendment?
Yes, we did, Senator.
I had a question, Senator Westland, on the amendment itself, 1.8, where it states coordinate and train stakeholder responders. Could you tell me what a stakeholder responder might be?
Senator Westland.
Mr. Chair, Senator Limmer, perhaps one of my testifiers could explain to you what that term refers to.
County Attorney Choi, so you leaned into the camera.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And Senator Limmer, I think stakeholder responder would be, for the most part, police investigators. But at the same time, the way that we fight violent crime is that we recognize that there are other responders that can be a part of, not necessarily the investigation, but be a part of actually trying to help people feel safe. I gave you that example of a person who gets shot and they end up in the emergency room, and the police officer or the investigator oftentimes will be there and ask them, who shot you? And time again, we don't get that information from the person who got shot, or in many situations, maybe a witness. And it really boils down to the fact that many people don't feel safe, that they feel that there would be some aspect of retaliation if they were to be involved. And so a part of that is trying to coordinate with and work with our hospital-based violence interrupters, to work with other types of organizations that are also doing everything that they can to stop the gun violence. So primarily, it would be to work with police investigators to make sure that they understand what we need to prosecute a case. This type of approach, where you embed a prosecutor in the work of an investigative agency, can make a whole world of a difference. I can point to, for instance, when we started partnering more closely on sexual assault cases, where we had a prosecutor working hand in hand with the investigators so that they could make better decisions, quicker decisions, prioritize the things that needed to be prioritized, our charging rates with respect to that particular crime have dramatically increased over the course of the last 4 years. And I know that we can do the same thing for the non-fatal shootings. So it's primarily for the investigators to make sure that we're coordinating and we're training on the same things, but also too, there are other responders out there that are part of the solution and getting to the place of interrupting the violence. And also, we need to figure out ways to help victims and witnesses in our cases feel safe, that they can have the place where they feel like they can participate in helping us find the truth and testifying in court and not being retaliated against. That's probably another conversation that I hope the legislature will think about. There will be other bills. There's a lot of money appropriated for fighting violent crime. But I hope this legislature will also recognize that we need to focus also on victim and witness protection and safety.
Senator Limmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Historically, money for prosecutors come from counties, and public defenders get their money from the state. Senator Westland, have you gotten any reaction from our public defense bar in reaction to more money going to prosecutors? They seem to always come and make that distinction that prosecutors get more money out of their counties than the budget for public defenders. Have you gotten any comment from them regarding this particular budget?
Senator
Mr.
Westland.
Chairman, Senator Limmer, I have not heard from them. And I do know that actually, my recollection is I believe we did pass a bill related to funding the Public Defender's Office. I think this bill in particular is targeted and focused on current caseload backlogs and really trying to get tools through a grant process for folks to be able to make those reductions. That could be funding used for staff, additional attorneys, more equipment, and so on. And so I think this addresses a specific need. Yeah, and go ahead, County Attorney Moriarty has something to say as well.
County Attorney Moriarty.
Senator Latz, Senator Limmer, this would actually help public defenders in a big way, and I have a good example for you. As you know, we have a new police chief in Minneapolis, and he and I have developed a very positive relationship. And I told him that we as an office did not get body cam or video when we were charging cases. In fact, we would get it sometimes weeks after the fact. Then we would give it to public defenders right before a critical appearance, and they would have to ask for a continuance because they would need time. When we do that, it creates a bigger backlog in the system because we aren't able to get the discovery that we need to get to them at an early date. And the good news about this bill and what we could do going forward is that Chief O'Hara and I came to an agreement where he said, we want you to have body cam at the time you charge. And so we worked together. We have launched that a couple of weeks ago. We currently don't have the resources to look at all of it before we charge. We've promised to try to look at search and seizure and other critical portions. But this bill could be something where we could apply for a grant where we could have people who could look at that video early on and make sure that we had a strong case, or we could talk to law enforcement how to build a better case. So this would be a huge thing, and it would help public defenders because it doesn't help anybody to continue cases because we are not able to fulfill our constitutional obligations in a timely fashion.
Thank you.
Any further questions or discussion? I'm not seeing any, so at this time, Senate File 2914 is laid over for possible inclusion in our budget bill. Thank you all. Senator Westland, you're going to present Senator Mitchell's Senate File 2225, I understand.
I
Members,
am.
it will be distributed right now.
And I believe I do have a testimony. Hi. How are you? So, Mr. Chair, while that's being distributed, I am presenting
Senator
this
Westland.
on behalf of Senator Mitchell. And there is an amendment that is being passed out, which is the A3 amendment. And then I also did ask Ms. Primo to be sure to note for us what portions of the bill fall under the jurisdiction of the Judiciary Committee.
We're going to ask Ms. Primo to do that right now so we can focus testimony and questions only on those provisions. Ms. Primo.
Mr. Chair and members, it is Section 1, which amends Chapter 13, the data practices provisions, and the A3 also amends that same provision, Section 1 of the A3 as well.
So, Senator Westland, why don't you tell us what it is that we are focusing on here today about the bill? And then this is not an author's amendment, so we'll consider the content of the A3 amendment after you've described things. Unless you want your
Great.
witness to describe it.
Perhaps so, since I'm filling in for Senator
All right,
Mitchell.
So we will welcome Taya Moxley Goldsmith to the committee, the Director of the Data Practices Office. Go
Chair
ahead, ma'am.
Latz and
Identify
members.
yourself and proceed.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the chance to testify. My name is Taya Moxley Goldsmith. I'm the Director of the Data Practices Office with the Minnesota Department of Administration. We are a statewide resource on data practices and the open meeting law for members of the public and government. And I am here for Section 1 of Senate File 2225. And thank you to Senator Westland and Senator Mitchell for bringing this bill. This relates to data challenges and data challenge appeals, which is in Section 1304 of the 13.04 of the Data Practices Act. Data subjects have the right to challenge the accuracy and completeness of data that government maintains about them. And most of the time, the data is just corrected at that time, but there are sometimes disagreements, and when a data subject disagrees with the determination that a government entity has made, they can appeal to the Commissioner of Administration. And the Data Practices Office administers that process for her. So the bill does a couple things. One, the proposed language moves existing requirements from the administrative rules and puts it in the statute so that it's clearer both for the government entity and for the data subject to know what their rights and responsibilities are. Some government folks don't even know that there are administrative rules, and certainly data subjects are not aware. So having that in one place is, for transparency, I think is really helpful for both parties. And then the second thing it does is it adds language confirming that the commissioner has permissive authority to dismiss appeals without offering informal resolution or setting it for a contested case hearing in these three limited circumstances. One is when an appeal is not timely, so it's outside of the 60-day time limit, and that's part of those existing requirements that come from the administrative rules. When the appeal involves evidence previously presented in a court proceeding where the data subject was a party, because the data challenge appeal process is really not meant to be an opportunity to relitigate criminal trials. And then when the data are not about the individual challenging the accuracy and completeness. So that is a right that belongs to the data subject. Someone else cannot challenge the data on behalf of another person. The exception is, of course, parents of minor children or guardians of incapacitated adults. And so, and then there's just some renumbering for clarity, because right now it's 3 big paragraphs with a lot of requirements. So that, in general, is what it does, and I'm happy to respond to any questions that members might have.
Thank you for your testimony. The A3 amendment is mostly about Section 1 of the bill. It's to delete everything of Section 1 and replaces it, and that was what we just received testimony on. But I have a question about the amendment, because page 6 of, or line 2.10 of the amendment proposes to delete an entire section from the bill that was apparently passed out of the State and Local Government Committee and sent to us, and also proposes to add another section of law to the repealers section. I'm not sure that we are properly the jurisdiction to address either of these provisions. So maybe I can get some guidance from our stand-in chief author or our witness or our counsel. Anyone have any guidance for us on this?
The repealers moved. That would be helpful. I'm phoning a friend.
Can you give us, where's this bill go from here?
This bill goes back to state and local government entrance.
Okay, this bill is going to go back to its original committee, state and local government. So I'm going to ask Senator Westland to move it this time to move the A3 amendment, but deleting the amendment from page 2.10 and 2.11. Since those provisions are not properly within our jurisdiction, it's going back to the committee that deals with them. They can address that at that time if they wish.
Mr. Chair, that makes sense to me. I think so. It'll be dealt with when it returns to the other committee, I think.
All right. Any questions or discussion about the A3 amendment relating to Section 1 of the bill? Senator Limmer.
Before we get too far along, I wanted to ask the question on the A3 amendment, lines 1.21 and 22, where it states an individual may submit an appeal to the commissioner within 60 days. What is our standard practice now?
Chair Latz, Senator Limmer, thank you for that question. Those are the existing requirements from the administrative rules, and those have been in place since 1981. So that's the existing standard.
So are we, Mr. Chair,
Senator
are
Limmer.
we just simply codifying the rule that's established already?
Chair Latz, Senator
Ms.
Limmer,
Moxley
yes.
Smith. All right. Any other questions or discussion? Seeing none, Senator Westland moves the A3 amendment as amended. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion prevails. The amendment is adopted. Now to Senate File 2225 as amended. Senator Westland moves that it, as amended, be recommended to pass and be re-referred to the Senate Committee on State and Local Government and Veterans. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion prevails. Thank you. Senator Pappas.
She has three of them, but
First one.
I wanted to do this one first, but her testifiers might have to leave for some of this, so I told her.
Senator Pappas, we're going to look to you for guidance. Which of your bills you wish to have heard first? I know you've got some testifiers here that are
Thank you,
on some time
Mr. Chairman. My testifiers, I think, are good until like 2:15, so Senate File 412.
All right, Senate File 412.
I'd like to invite Professor Peterson, Professor Densley up here to join me. Great. Mr. Chairman,
Senator Pappas.
This legislation is to provide some one-time money to to establish the violent, not established, but to support the Violence Prevention Project Research Center. It's a nonprofit, nonpartisan research center dedicated to reducing violence in society and using data and analysis to improve policy and practice. Their research on mass shootings funded by the National Institute of Justice has received global media attention. Their areas of expertise include gun violence, violent extremism, cyber violence, trauma and mental illness, street gangs, and youth violence. They conduct high-quality, high-impact research for public consumption. The Violence Prevention Project also provides media commentaries and develop and deliver education and training to support concerned citizens, K-12 schools, colleges and universities, workplaces, houses of worship, and other public or private clients in their strategic response to violence. And just on a side note, I didn't hear about the book, which Senator Westrom is going to hold up. Show and tell. But I did learn about the project when I was on a meeting with my school district on a Zoom meeting, and we were talking about what we might to do about, having some kind of threat assessment systems or do violence prevention in the schools. And that's when I learned about the work that Professor Peterson and Densley have been doing. The Violence Project has developed an integrated, interdisciplinary understanding of violence and a holistic approach to addressing it. They're best known for their work on gun violence prevention. The Violence Project also pioneered a new mental illness, crisis intervention, and de-escalation training for law enforcement that has changed the way officers think about community policing. I'll now turn it over to my testifiers to speak more on the Violence Prevention Project Research Center.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for that, Senator Pappas. My name is Jillian Peterson. I'm a professor of criminology and forensic psychology at Hamlin. I'm a psychologist by training. And in a previous life, I was an investigator on death penalty cases, and I developed life histories of people facing the death penalty, which is kind of the perspective that I bring to this work. So James and I developed the Violence Prevention Project Research Center about 3 years ago, coming out of our work on mass shootings. We developed a database of mass shooters, conducted interviews across the countries with mass shooters and people who knew them. And that database has been downloaded thousands of times by policymakers and practitioners, journalists, researchers. Our goal is to add data to our conversations around gun violence prevention and violence prevention. We take a really data-driven, nonpartisan approach. And for that reason, we see a lot of support of our work sort of across the political spectrum. It's something that we find can really bring people together when you're doing the deep dive into these really complex roots of violence. So we're now expanding our work. We've been working with the St. Paul Public Schools to understand the root causes of their increases in violence, and we've launched a new project looking at the increase in homicides in the Twin Cities during the pandemic to really try to get a deep understanding of what really happened so we can build really evidence-based prevention strategies moving forward. I'll turn it over to James.
Thank you, Dr. Peterson.
Thank you, members of the committee. Thank you so much for having us here today. My name is James Densley. I'm a sociologist by training. I'm a professor of criminal justice at Metropolitan State University. And in a previous life, I was a middle school special education teacher. So I come at a lot of this work with a practitioner's perspective as much as I do a researcher's perspective. And really, what I would like to say here today is that this funding will enable us to really build upon the foundation that we have created over the last 3 years with the work that we've done to become a critical resource for Minnesotans, for practitioners and for policymakers, to provide technical assistance in areas like school threat assessment, as was mentioned earlier, and also to evaluate existing policy and practice around gun violence prevention so that we can really guide the decisions that we make with evidence. So a lot of this is really about expanding the work that we're doing, making sure that the work that we do feeds back into policy and practice, and that we make decisions based on evidence and data and analysis. And so with that, I think we're probably out of time, and we're very happy to answer questions. Thank you very much.
Do any members of the committee have any questions or comments? Senator Westland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much. As I mentioned previously, God bless you, when we were speaking, I've been listening to the book, The Violence Project, How to Stop a Mass Shooting Epidemic, and your research is really compelling and very interesting to me. And I know that you are, at this time, seeking some additional funding. Can you talk a little bit about, you've done a lot on mass shooters and developed this database. So what are sort of the next areas of research that you would like to do that this funding would help with?
Sure, I could take it.
Dr. Peterson.
Yes, we are interested in really expanding our work. So looking at community homicides, looking at domestic violence, looking at violence in the schools. We would love to do a large-scale national survey, which hasn't been done, looking at things like safe storage practices, the impact of violence on people and communities. We've seen sort of the ripple effects of the impacts of violence. And then evaluating things like, how do you encourage safe storage practices? If we do implement something like a extreme risk protection order, what are the implications of that? And so doing some evaluation of policies as they come to pass.
Senator Westland.
So part of what you may be able to assist policymakers with is sort of post-implementation research projects that I think would be very beneficial for policymakers to sort of return to see what's working, what isn't working, what are perhaps some tweaks that need to be made. Is that sort of what some of the benefit that you may be able to provide?
Yeah, that's exactly the intent. And one of the other things I think is important here is, we are a nonpartisan group and we're an independent research center. And so that enables us to do this in a way, we're really well known for the kind of mixed methods approach that we have. So we're doing quantitative data analysis, but we're also doing qualitative interviews embedded within communities, which is often beyond the remit of sort of state agencies. But it also means that the recommendations that we can make and everything else will be data driven and not sort of skewed by political bias and other things as well.
One last one.
Senator Westland.
I saw the look. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And some of the research that you have done in terms of, we were just speaking about addressing violence in our communities and so on. My understanding of some of the research that you've done are that a lot of folks who engage, particularly in your research in mass shooters and violence, that these are often folks who are suicidal. And more importantly, that these are often folks who are in crisis for a period of time, that crisis may be known to people around them, that they often leak their plans to other people, and so some appropriate method to intervene with people in crisis may actually be an effective way to address those sorts of things. Could you very briefly comment on that?
Sure, yeah,
Dr.
that was one
Peterson.
of the main findings that came out of that mass shooter research, is that perpetrators of mass shootings, it's a form of suicide, it's an angry suicide, that over 80% of them are in a known state of crisis, that the majority leak their plans. For school shooters, nearly 80% tell somebody else they're going to do it. And so we see all of these warning signs, which really leaves a lot of opportunity for intervention at that stage.
Senator Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess my question is, as I've looked at the data, it appears to me that the vast number of gun deaths in Minnesota are suicides going down that road. And I got a couple of questions, and I'll try to maybe answer them all at once if you'd prefer. One thing, do you separate those out from the other research products? And is there any research, or you plan to do any research on the availability and the production of mental health and faith in reducing that suicide rate and the gun violence? Because I think that's the piece that is missing. We haven't built out our mental health process, and that's, to me, the root cause. So do you separate that stuff out, or are you just going after one piece?
Dr. Fensley.
I can answer that. So, as was mentioned before with our work on mass shootings, we really were struck with this overlap between suicide and homicide. And what we've really tried to do in the course of our work is to be approaching violence from a holistic perspective. So you're looking at the many forms of gun violence, as you mentioned, suicide being part of this, but also the many contributing factors to it. And one of the things we've really taken a deep dive to in the course of our work is mental health. And we've looked at the ways in which, for example, mass shootings are like deaths of despair, where you see this trend, this crisis point, and this slow build toward violence over time. And it's a pathway. It's not a profile. It's a pathway to this type of violence. And there are multiple opportunities for intervention on the way. So we're careful, of course, not to stigmatize mental illness and focus on mental health in a positive way, but recognizing that there's a lot of work to be done in that area, and that often it is the absence of adequate resources and interventions on that pathway that then result in violence deeper along the lines. And as a sociologist, Gillian is a psychologist, we've really found a nice way to kind of balance these whole society perspectives with also what's going on the individual level. And often that comes down to mental health.
Senator Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And the follow-up question would be, so do you look at the connection and the reduction of faith as the increase in the law and the mental health crisis and the increase in suicide? Is that part of the study?
So actually what's interesting about that is we have a chapter in the book, the second chapter is titled America. And it's a pretty deep dive into sort of the changing nature of the cultural fabric of the United States over the last 100+ years. And one of the big focuses of that is actually around faith in some ways, and also how the seminal studies around suicide often looked at this idea around the lack of connection and the lack of community that people felt as a contributing factor toward self-harm. And so it is a feature of our work that we've done. And in my other research projects as well, I've looked at the role of faith, for instance, in gang intervention projects, and also in the role of faith in prison environments, and how this can be really important for building community and camaraderie and being a buffer that prevents violence. So it is a feature of the work, definitely.
Thank you. Members, we are going to lay over Senate File 412 for possible
Mr. Chair?
inclusion in our budget bill.
Mr. Chair.
Senator Kroon, I'm
Thank
sorry, I
you,
didn't
Mr.
see
Chair.
you were interested.
You do national work, and I imagine perhaps Minnesota's not a large enough sample size to do the type of work that you're looking to do, but you're asking the Minnesota taxpayer to fund it. So I guess my question is are you going to be doing anything with this money that would be Minnesota specific, or what benefit specifically does the Minnesota taxpayer get out of this?
It's a good question.
Dr. Peterson.
Yes, we do national work, but we are really interested in being really a regional hub. I'm originally from here, went to St. Paul Central High School. Our project that we have going on at the St. Paul schools right now is a really good example where we've kind of embedded ourselves in the St. Paul public schools. We're looking at all of the incidents of gun violence over the last 5 years, what's driving them, what is the increase, what would prevention look like. Same thing our Joyce Foundation project is with Twin Cities homicides. So we're looking at the rise in homicides specifically in the Twin Cities over the last 5 years, doing interviews with incarcerated perpetrators, families, people who knew them, to really get at what is really driving this. There's a lot of people have guesses about what's driving it, but we haven't done the real research. My guess is the implications from those studies will have national implications, but we really want to be sort of a state resource as a nonprofit based here.
Thank you. All right, Senate File 412 is laid over for possible inclusion in the budget bill. Thank you, doctors. Senator Pappas, which?
Mr. Chairman, I think 615, I'm sorry, I think 2434, the State Fire Marshal, I think would probably be quick.
Senate File 2484 is before us now. We'll have the materials distributed to the members. If the two witnesses, Tom Brace and John Nischa, will come forward, please. At this time, take the empty testifier seats. Senator Pappas, tell us about your bill.
Are we taking up House File 2026? I'm confused here. Maybe I have the wrong talking points. So we're still on the Senate file.
It is House File 2606 is the companion to Senate File 2484.
Okay, but we're still in the Senate file.
We are.
Okay, sorry. Senate File 2484. It's a simple bill to help the fire suppression industry, their customers, and the State Fire Marshal Division. The bill transfers funding to increase fire protection staffing in the State Fire Marshal Division to reduce turnaround time and the time for plan reviews and inspections by moving the funds received from sprinkler permits, license certificates, and fines from the state general fund into a dedicated account to be used solely to operate the State Fire Marshal Fire Protection Program. And I have with me two testifiers today.
Thank you, Senator Pappas. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Tom Brace. I was the former Minnesota State Fire Marshal from 1987 to 2003. And prior to that, I was the Washington State Fire Marshal for about 10 years. We'd like to thank Senator Pappas for authoring Senate File 2484. You heard about the bill from Senator Pappas. We are asking you to dedicate the revenue collected from the sprinkler contractors through the fees they pay for fire suppression, plan reviews, sprinkler permits, and more into a dedicated account for public safety purposes. They were originally intended to be a dedicated account in the early 1990s. These fees were not dedicated at that time the law was passed due to the state of Minnesota losing a major lawsuit with Cambridge Bank. And I think there may well be some senators in the room that have the history of remembering that loss. Many new revenue sources include the fire protection fees were diverted from their intended purpose to pay for the monetary damages assessed by the court. The lack of sufficient revenue has kept the program understaffed and unable to keep up with the expanding needs and requirements. At this point, I'd like to turn over the testimony to my next testifier, Mr. John Nishja. John Nishja brings 33 years of experience in the State Fire Marshal Division, 44 years of fire service experience, and is currently employed by the Minnesota chapter, actually the National Fire Sprinkler Association, as I am. So, John Nishja.
Mr. Nishja, welcome to the Judiciary Committee. Please go ahead and introduce yourself and proceed with your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Latz. Members of the committee, appreciate the opportunity to present in front of you today. My name is John Nishja. I'm with the National Fire Sprinkler Association. I'm a fire protection and data specialist with them. As Mr. Brace indicated, I had the honor and privilege of serving 44 years in the fire service as a firefighter and fire marshal. So, from 2005 until 2022, when I retired from the State Fire Marshal's Division, I supervised their fire protection plan review and data sections. So, over the last 15 years, the State Fire Marshal has conducted an average of 462 plan reviews per year. That equals about 153 per each staff member that they had of the three doing that. So typical sprinkler plan reviews take 4 to 6 hours. However, some large complex systems might take days or in some rare cases even weeks to do. So the high workload does not allow the staff at the State Fire Marshal's office to have adequate time to do the field inspections, to investigate law and rule violations, to conduct training and continuing education for members of the industry or the local code officials. So passage of Senate File 2484 will move about $480,000 to $500,000 from fees into that new special revenue account. That will allow for additional staff to be hired. That staff will be able to complete more on-site inspections of installations. They'll be able to reduce the plan review turnaround time, resulting in fewer delays for the construction industry. They'll provide training for sprinkler contractors, installers, designers, and the code officials that approve them on a local level. It'll provide more resources to investigate violations. The majority of the contractors are good, reputable contractors, but occasionally you do have one that wants to cut corners. And it will also establish consistency with the Minnesota Department of Labor and Industry, who gets to keep their plan review and permit fees in a special revenue account for them to be able to conduct their permits, plan reviews, and inspections. So we ask that you support passage of this legislation to allow this important life safety program to continue and to ensure that these fire suppression systems are installed right, designed right, reviewed right, permitted properly, and so on, and therefore protecting the citizens of the state of Minnesota. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Nishja. At this time, we'll open up the floor for members of the committee. If there are any questions or comments, the plan is to lay this bill over. Senator Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as I just had a recent conversation with a jurisdiction that asked me to take on, they asked me if I would take on their sprinkler plan review, and as I had done it in years past, but I declined because it takes an absorbent amount of time, and to me, the review fee, the fees you get on it don't pay for the person, enough for the person's time to do it. So as a business person, I humbly declined that I would not do that we rely on the state to do those reviews because it's too time consuming for us to stay current and as a local official to stay current and up to speed on all the, as this technology continues to get better and better and the expertise you need to do it reliably when people's lives are counting on it. I think this is a good bill, so I support this. I think it's, you know, the State Fire Marshal's Office is relied upon to do a lot of things for us, and So I support this movement. I don't know exactly what the history is of having this move back and forth, but in this case, I would support the bill.
Senator Limmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I noticed in reading the bill, the lines that were stricken, lines 1.9 strikes any monies that come from gifts and grants and reimbursements are removed from the sources of this account. And it looks like you're only relying on fees and penalties on lines 1.7. So I was wondering, is this something new that you're not going to receive revenue from gifts or grants? Is that the intent?
Senator Pappas.
I've just had a whisper in my ear here that they don't really receive any grants, so I think it's probably just the language that's not needed.
Mr. Chair.
Senator Limmer.
Also in the form of gifts, that no longer is a practice, or it never really materialized?
Yeah, never really materialized. Thank you. Another whisper in my ear.
Just checking. Thank you.
Any further questions or discussion from the committee? Not seeing any, Senate File 2484 is laid over for possible inclusion in the omnibus bill. Thank you. Senator Pappas, Senator Gustafson, who does not serve on our committee, has arrived. We'd like to give her the testifier table for now, and we'll come back after that. Senator Gustafson, come on forward. Senate File 2137, please. And the testifiers for your bill, we've got Mitch Kuhn and Commissioner Schnell. Keep in mind, testifiers, we just spent 45 minutes or an hour on Monday hearing a presentation from the Department of Corrections about their budget request. So please, let's not be duplicative. Let's just focus precisely on the matter before us today, and we'll go that route. So, Senator Gustafson.
Thank you, Chair Latz and members. I'm here today to be the voice for the corrections officers in my district and throughout Minnesota who are at a point of crisis we can no longer ignore. It's hard to see the news stories of assault and overwhelmed corrections officers, and I'm heartbroken by the stories the corrections officers in my district in particular share about their stress, danger, and growing hopelessness that they feel constantly. I'm also outraged that we expect them to take on all of their duties for about the same wage you get as working a part-time retail job. Our prisons are at a point of crisis, not just for our corrections officers, but for the inmates as well. Because we do not pay our COs a wage worthy of the stress they endure, the turnover at our prisons is shocking. We can't keep them well enough staffed to perform basic functions like maintaining the safety of officers and inmates. Prisoners can't get adequate recreation or even shower time because we do not have enough COs to supervise. Few COs can manage to keep up with the face double the physical, mental, and financial burden of doing their jobs. Just in the last few weeks, we had multiple safety incidents at our prisons make the news. These were far from the first, and I expect that unless we act, it's only a matter of months until we hear about the next issues. I want to remind this committee that the lives have been lost because we do not pay enough attention to correction officers at their jobs. I fully support recruitment incentives, workplace trainings, workplace wellness initiatives to help our COs cope, but the truth is these initiatives will fail if we don't first pay our COs a fair wage. Our COs and prison officials have been crying out to all of us at the legislature to fix this problem for years now. Today I offer Senate File 2137 to do just that. The bill appropriates $62 million in 2024, $95 million in 2025, and sets the value at $92 million in the subsequent bienniums so that the Corrections Department can raise the CO's salary to a fair and long overdue level. Please join me in supporting this bill and supporting this overlooked part of our public safety system. Thank you. Mr. Chair, when you're ready, our testifiers can begin.
Senator Gustafson, before we do that, Mr. Turner's behind you, has some information for you.
There's your amendment.
Yes. Thank you. Yes, Mr. Chair, I apologize.
Senator
We do have an
Gustafson.
amendment.
We will have the amendment distributed to the committee. While we're doing that, why don't we go with our testifiers? Mr. Kuhn, go ahead. Identify yourself and testify.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of this committee. I'm Mitch Cooney. I'm a corrections sergeant with the Minnesota Department of Corrections for almost 10 years. Thank you for the opportunity to testify to you before today. I stand before you in support of Bill 2137. Recent events have shown a disturbing assaults against our brave officers who work tirelessly to maintain order and security within our prisons. We must take action to address this issue by increasing the number of officer positions within the Minnesota Department of Corrections. By doing so, we can ensure that our correctional officers have the support they need to maintain the safety and order within our prisons. Additionally, increasing the number of officers will reduce the number of inmates per officer, which in turn will help prevent future attacks. I bring this matter to you guys today because it affects me personally. After 10 years of working in the Department of Corrections, I still bring home less than $1,300 in a 2-week period. This is simply not enough to support my family and I, especially in the eyes of the danger and risk that myself and my counterpart officers face across the state. We cannot ignore the dangerous nature of this work, nor can we neglect the safety and security of our officers and the offenders that they supervise in an already challenging and stressful environment. It is our duty to provide them with the support they need to carry the department's mission safely and effectively. We must also recognize the mental and emotional toll this job takes on our officers, the physical violence they face on a daily basis, along with the constant threat of potential harm or injury, and the lasting psychological damage they endure. We must take care of our officers both physically and mentally. To address this issue, I'm asking the legislator to dedicate funds specifically for correctional officer salaries based on our position numbers and the staff to post ratios necessary to ensure the safety. This would effectively earmark money to attract and retain capable and committed staff, ensuring its use is effective and deliberate in a timely manner. The staff needs of each facility, based on the number of posts and hours per each day, must be staffed, can be easily determined. The cost of staffing can then be approximated and funded based on the cost of the wages and benefits paid to the correctional officers. Implementing these recommendations will not only improve the overall safety and effectiveness of Minnesota's correctional facilities, but also demonstrates the state's commitment to the well-being of its officers and the proper functioning of its correctional system. As you deliberate on the matter of 2137, I ask you to keep in mind the experiences of all the dedicated correctional staff across the state. The challenges we face are just not matters of policy, but directly impact our lives and the safety of our facilities. We will continue to lose dedicated and experienced officers if we are continually underpaid and unable to be financially successful. The era of working in dangerous conditions without proper pay and support has long passed. I understand the committee faces difficult decisions, and I appreciate the time and effort you devote to addressing these concerns I've highlighted today. With your leadership, I am confident that we can find a solution that balances the various interests at stake and promotes the well-being of all Minnesotans. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Cooney, and thank you for your service as well. Commissioner Schnell.
Mr. Chair, Paul Schnell, Commissioner of the Department of Corrections, and I absolutely agree that Minnesota should invest more in its corrections officers and corrections staff. Like many public safety sectors, the DOC is facing a staffing crisis, requiring forced overtime to keep the facilities running and to secure. Far too often, staff come in for a shift not knowing for sure if they will work 8 hours or 16 hours. Bottom line is we have to offer competitive wages if we want to recruit and retain, which is critical to prison operations and attainment of our mission, reducing crime through reductions in repeat offending. We also need to honor the collective bargaining process, and we're committed to working together within that contract process to increase wages and ultimately stabilize our workforce. Knowing all this, the governor has recommended investments in our current workforce in recruitment and retention and in safety and security of Minnesota's prisons. That includes $144 million to maintain current operations and, importantly, to support staff through bargain for compensation increases. It also provides the creation for a correctional officer college employee program, a staff wellness program, and additional capacity in our staff support and wellness unit. In addition, there is $4 million over the next biennium for training and professional development for all DOC staff. We recognize that safety is critical. We support measures to support our correction system, which we had the opportunity to talk about on Monday. And with that, Mr. Chair, I would stand for any questions.
Thank you. Members, we have the A1 amendment in front of us. Now this is an author's amendment. So Senator Uma verbatim moves adoption of the A1 amendment to Senate File 2137. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion prevails. The amendment is adopted. Any final comments, Senator Gustafson?
I just, thank you, Mr. Chair. As somebody who has Lino Lakes prison system in our district, we were recently in the news based on some violence towards corrections officers, and that was after I'd already met with Officer Cooney and his group. This is a problem that's growing, something that needs to be addressed. I'm proud to be able to bring this bill, and I ask for your support.
I should ask if there are any comments from members of the committee. Senator Kroon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree that corrections officers need a substantial pay increase from everything I've been able to ascertain. We had some discussion at the governor's budget proposal bill about body cams and other equipment. And I was just wondering, Mr. Cooney, if you had any thoughts on the necessity of that, or whether you'd like to see all available funds go towards salary increases, or your general thoughts on that.
Mr. Cooney.
Thank you, Senator. In regards to the body cams, I do see that there's the opportunity where they could be beneficial, but in the current plan as a widespread rollout, I do not support that from a personal perspective. We have endless amounts of cameras within our facilities, but I do recognize there are unique opportunities where a body cam could be essential. I think that it's going to have substantial cost that comes along with it, and there's some definitely needed other areas that money is needed.
Senator Kroon.
So, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that response. So maybe some targeted areas, but not universal body cam. Focus more on wages, salary increases, and using resources that way is kind of what I'm hearing. Well, another question for anybody at the table is on the A1 amendment. It looks like some pretty specific dollar amounts. Has there been any calculations done in terms of what type of percent pay increase, generally speaking, that this amount here would provide for, or number of new corrections officers, any kind of data like that?
Mr. Chair,
Senator
Senator Kruen, I thought somebody here was going to be here from the labor union that might be able to address why those numbers were picked, but they were intentional as ways to not just retain, but to recruit. And then those dollar amounts lined up with what was sort of proposed in the governor's budget. So that's where we landed on those numbers, if that makes sense.
Senator Kroon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and I can follow up. It did look like it was a deliberate number, and that's why I thought maybe that data was available. Sounds like it is, but maybe we just need to follow up on that later. So appreciate the response. Thanks.
Senator Limmer. Before you do that, Mr. Turner might be able to address that last question.
Mr. Chair,
Mr.
Senator
Turner.
Kroon, the number was derived by adding the maintained current services for the institutions within the Department of Corrections line in the governor's budget with the retention and recruitment recommendation by the governor in the governor's budget. And so these numbers are derived from the governor's rec, two lines, maintain current services, which would include all salary increases, salary and benefit increases, recruitment and retention, which includes the programs that some of the programs the commissioner talked about.
Senator Limmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I look at this, this looks like these dollar amounts are specifically referenced just for additional correction officers, officer salaries, and recruitment bonuses. Could someone give me an idea of, I just want to underscore this. This is not for any other funding within the correction system, such as administration or programming. This is strictly for line officers that do the work in our facilities. Is that correct?
Senator Gustafson.
Mr. Chair, I apologize, the bill copy is not in my folder, but if I just go off of memory, yes, it is intentionally made to put more recruitment and retainment into the officers on the floor. And that's why the bill was brought forward, so that we could sort of highlight what the needs were with our corrections officers.
If this
Senator Limmer.
bill is passed, what would be the beginning salary of a CO in Minnesota's correction system? What would it change from and to?
Senator Gustafson.
Mr. Chair, I would probably lean on either one of my testifiers to answer that question. Again, I am not aware, and I thought a representative from the labor union would be here, but I'm happy to defer to either one of my testifiers with the chair's permission.
Senator Gustafson, someone just approached behind you. Are you, on this bill, sir?
Mr. Chair, here he is.
To answer this question?
Yeah.
All right, and members, this bill will be laid over for possible inclusion, just for your information.
Sorry.
Go ahead, sir, identify your name and
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee
Answer
members.
the
My name is
question if you
Ethan Vogel, Legislative Director for AFSCME, Council 5. Senator Limmer, we would still rely on the traditional collective bargaining process within this framework. So I can't give you a dollar amount for the starting wage.
Well, Mr. Chair.
Senator Limmer.
When I buy something, I'd like to know what the real value is. And I'm kind of surprised we don't have that figure in front of us. I am satisfied that it's going to go directly for correction officers. The administration has grown quite large in the Department of Corrections, and the officers have continually brought that to my attention. As we're trying to attract and retain officers, we've had this discussion in law enforcement for a few years. And sometimes salaries are not just the only thing that could cause an attraction or a retaining of an experienced officer, which is really who we are targeting. We want that experienced officer. Are there any other ideas? This seems to be just focused on salaries and a recruitment bonus. Could someone tell me what the recruitment bonus would be? Dollar amount.
Mr. Chair and Senator Limmer, again, we would go through the collective bargaining process. So our elected members and the employer would meet and negotiate over available resources. I can say that what we need to do is increase starting wages and move everybody up throughout the grid. What we're not able to do right now is recruit all of the positions that are currently funded, and that's a real problem. So if we can simply fill the positions that are currently funded through the Department of Corrections, that will go a long way into increasing the safety within these facilities. And that's what I've been hearing from our members, similar to what you noted, that we can increase the staffing levels simply by filling all of the positions that are currently funded, but we can't do that right now because the state is not a competitive employer compared to other employers at this time.
Yeah. Mr. Chair.
Senator Limmer.
I want everyone to know I support this bill. Matter of fact, I had hoped to be a co-author on the bill, but I see all the authorships are filled on the bill. But nevertheless, the experience that this committee has had in trying to attract and retain law enforcement, we did talk about hiring bonuses. We've even talked about adjusting pension benefits in order to retain officers. That might be something that you all might want to chat about. And just like law enforcement, you get to a certain point that correction officers, unless they're doing an office work as a supervisor, it really is a young person's game, walking cell blocks and tiers and dealing with people. So we may want to encourage that earlier retirement for the benefit and safety of everyone in a facility. But I do support the bill.
Not seeing any further discussion from the committee, Senate File 2137 is laid over for possible inclusion in the budget bill.
Thank you.
Senator Gustafson, Senate File 2712. understand Mr. Elwood is here to answer any questions if they are needed, or if Senator Gustafson is not in a position to answer them. Members, you're having your packet distributed to you at this time. This bill comes to us from another committee. There are no amendments in the packet. Senator Gustafson, if you or Mr. Elwood could describe the bill briefly, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I do appreciate having Mr. Elwood with me, as I'm probably the only person not a lawyer in this room, so it is nice to have that resource. Through physical and emotional abuse and commonly associated with domestic violence, economic abuse has come to be recognized as a prevalent and equally devastating form of coercive control. A new term, coerced debt, has emerged to describe the circumstances under which a survivor becomes saddled with involuntary credit card and other debt that creates a serious barrier to independence. Survivors of domestic violence are not only individuals who are subjected to coerced debt, victims of sex or labor trafficking also suffer the same type of economic abuse. Economic security is critical for survivors to break free from an abusive or exploitive relationship. Coerced debt impedes or prevents survivors from moving on in their lives. Having unwanted debt that the survivor never wanted and for which the survivor has never benefited leaves the survivor facing liability and debt collectors, as well as a severely damaged credit report. Having a good credit report affects everything from employment to housing to getting a loan. It's vital to accessing needed credit and for financial security. The bad credit rating and unfair debt can negatively impact the survivor for years and years. 3 states have recently taken up to address this problem. SF 2712 seeks to address this problem here in Minnesota. It does 3 things. 1, it makes causing coerced debt a prohibited act. 2, it gives the survivor a legal path to have the debt declared coerced, relieving the survivor of liability. 3, it allows the court to assign the liability to the abuser who caused the debt to be incurred. Finally, I want to thank the many groups who understood the importance of this bill and worked closely with us to ensure that it worked for everyone. The Minnesota Credit Union Network, the Minnesota Bankers Association, the Great Lakes Credit and Collection Association, the Consumer Data Industry Association and Equifax, the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce, the Minnesota Retailers Association, and Bank N. Mr. Ron Elwood from Legal Aid is with me and can answer any technical questions, and I ask for your support and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Senator Gustafson. Just to let the members know, the anticipated action will be to take action and move the bill to the floor when we're done with our discussion. Any questions or comments from members of the committee at this time? I'm not seeing any at this time. Senator Umu Verbatim moves that Senate File 27. I'm sorry, Senator Kroon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Got to get your hand up faster.
Sorry, yeah, just real quick, is there anything in this bill that, that would affect liens?
Mr. Elwood, introduce
Mr.
yourself
Chair,
first and answer the question.
Mr. Chair and Senator Kroon, no, and in fact, if you notice on line 1.15, it excludes secured debt. And so I think we scrupulously try to avoid any of that, those entanglements.
Senator Kroon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any further questions or comments from the committee?
Mr. Chair, if I could just take a minute
Gustafson.
to thank you, Senator Seeberger and Senator Umu Verbatim for joining me on this bill as well.
With that said, Senator Seeberger will move Senate File 2712 be recommended to pass and be sent to the Senate floor. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion prevails.
Thank you.
Thank you. Members, Senate File 1657 is next. This is Senator Diedzik's bill. Senator Dibble will be presenting it on Senator Diedzik's behalf. Members, we do have the A1 amendment in our packets. This is not an author's amendment, as we are not the first stop. So why don't we have Senator Dibble explain the bill, and then we'll consider. I'm sorry. Let me correct it. Thank you, Ms. Primo. It went to a different committee and was withdrawn and sent back here. So we are the first committee to consider this bill. So we'll go ahead and deal with the author's amendment. Senator Uma Verbate moves adoption of the A1 amendment as an author's amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion prevails. The amendment is adopted. That was a delete everything amendment, so members just refer to your A1 amendment now in front of you. Senator Dibble.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Thank you on behalf of Senator Dietzig for the opportunity to present Senate File Number 1657. Very simply put, Mr. Chair and members, this bill would seek to solve a fairly straightforward problem, a little bit of a surprise that a problem like this would crop up in this day and age. But the short version of the problem as presented to Senator Dietzig was a business owner sought a business license from a municipality and provided all the required documents as a part of that process, including their tax return and their bank account, only to later discover that those documents were considered public, and the public did have the opportunity to scrutinize what I think we would all agree is private information. So this would classify those documents as private, and then would further require that they be destroyed 90 days after a final decision on the license application. I should mention that this bill and the amendment were developed through conversations with MNCOG and other stakeholders. I have a citizen here who is a business owner who was affected by this matter and can share a little bit of his story, Mr. Seeberger.
Mr. Seeberger, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you, Mr.
And,
Chair.
give
Thank
us
you,
your
members of the
testimony.
committee. Thank you, Senator Dibble. My name is Philip Seeberger. I'm a private citizen. I am a business owner. And in a former life, I was also an attorney who practiced in the Minnesota Data Practices Act and represented both municipalities and other units of government in responding to public data requests. I don't want to get too much more specific than that, just due to the sensitivity of this topic and the way in which under current law, certain licensing application data collected by municipalities are, because of an exclusion in the definition of what a licensing agency is in the Minnesota Government Data Practices Act, when collected by a municipal unit of government, is public data. And municipalities have wide-ranging freedom, depending on the type of business they're regulating, to set their own internal licensing requirements and of what they need to look at in order to determine whether somebody should be granted a license to do that particular business in that particular jurisdiction. And so there's not a lot of control over what that is, and it's probably a good thing that municipalities, being closest to the issue, can decide what those are. But sometimes they can require, and for probably very good public policy reasons, sensitive information that no reasonable person would ever suspect would be public. But because of the operation of the Minnesota Data Privacy Act, Government Data Act, sorry, which presumes that anything collected by an organ of government is public unless specifically excluded, there is no specific exclusion in statute currently for some of the data that has been collected. And this bill narrowly addresses one of those instances. Frankly, it's a little narrower, more narrowly tailored than I would personally feel comfortable, but it is compromise language reached with MNCOG, and I really appreciate their interest and their willingness to work with us on this particular language. So that is, and I'm grateful to Senator Dibble, Senator Dietzig, and then Representative Jordan and Representative Scott in the House for working with us on this particular issue too.
Thank you, Mr. Seeberger. Any questions, Senator Limmer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator Dibble, or your guest, I'm unfamiliar when a political subdivision requires tax records. Could you give me some examples of when that comes into play?
Mr. Steger.
Representative, or Senator Limmer, I'm hesitant to do so just because this is currently public information, the kind of information that's there. And by being specific about it, it could point an arrow to somebody who wants to get that information under a public data request.
Mr. Steger, I'm sorry, but we have to have an answer to this question
Okay.
to evaluate
Well,
the bill that's before us. So,
Mr. Chair, I can share with you what Senator Dietzig
Dibble.
has told me. So in the instance of licensure of a business, municipalities do a fairly extensive examination of an individual, their record, their background, their past dealings, et cetera. That's very common practice with business licensure for a number of reasons, to protect the public's interest and make sure that folks are as they present themselves if they're going to conduct business in their municipality. So tax records and bank statements and the like are very commonly requested as a part of the licensure examination and consideration.
Senator Kroon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I imagine some cities have taken it upon themselves to keep this information confidential without a statute requiring them. But how widespread, of a problem is how many cities don't do this voluntarily? Do you know?
Well,
Mr. Steger.
Mr. Chair, thank you. And Senator Kroon, because of the operation of state statute, municipalities have given a public data request around this kind of information. They're compelled by law they can't independently determine that this is not shareable, right? They have to make it public under the operation of the statute. And that's what we've been told, and business owners have been told about this data.
Senator Dibble.
Yes, Senator Kroon had a follow-up.
Senator Kroon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, that's troubling to hear, if that's true.
We better pass this bill pretty quick here, Senator Kroon.
Yeah. One other question I had is, I see that these things will be destroyed in 90 days, but what about during the pendency of the application and then during that 90 days? Isn't it still at risk, or what happens during that time period?
Mr. Chair.
Senator Dibble.
Thank you. It's a great question, Senator Kroon. No, because from according to the language of the A1 amendment, the data provided would be immediately classified as non-public, so it would be compelled to be maintained as private, not in public, and then ultimately destroyed.
Any further questions or discussion from the committee? Senator Howe.
And just a comment, because I've been in government regulation for probably a quarter of a century here, and I've never, ever heard of any of this data being collected. So on a sidebar, I'd be interested to know exactly what we're talking about, because we've never collected that type of information.
Right. And Senator Dibble.
Well, Mr. Chair, certain kinds of business licenses, I'm not sure of all, but definitely some kinds of business licenses. I know in Minneapolis, I worked for a city council member for a number of years. The kind of data that is collected, including records that support that information, is fairly extensive for really good reasons, actually. But it should be kept non-public. And I'll just say to Senator Kroon's shock and dismay, I first came into this area of, Senator Limmer and I have shared this interest over many years. And this all came to light when the city of Minneapolis started using vehicle license plate tracking technology with both stationary cameras and mobile cameras on police cars and the like. And if a local unit of government does not actively seek to classify that data as non-public, as private, then anyone can ask for it, and it turned out that was public data. People asked for, in this instance, just to make a point, the reporter who was turned on to the whole idea was able to figure out exactly where our mayor at that time had been over the past number of months, pretty much every day for the past 3 months. So municipalities, it doesn't occur to them. They collect data on volunteers, for example, public data, if they don't actively move to make that data non-public and private.
So we appreciate Mr. Steger's caution regarding, discretion regarding what kind of data is involved here. But I think we're going to have to move on at this point. Any other questions from members of the committee? Not seeing any. Senator Uma Verbaeten moves that Senate File 1657 as amended be recommended to pass and be sent to the Senate floor. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion prevails.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
members.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, members.
Okay, so we're going to take Senate File 2042 up next. Senator Kupec. Members, I'm just going to announce in terms of scheduling here, we are going to go until 3 o'clock. We still have quite a few bills left on the agenda for today. Anything that is not finished today will be added to Friday's agenda. You should maybe bring a sleeping bag on Friday. We have until 11:59 p.m. to meet our second deadline. And for those of you who are waiting to testify on bills, we're going to, in most cases, going to be limiting testimony to 2 minutes per testifier unless there are questions they need to respond to. So otherwise, we have no chance of getting through a lot of the bills on our agenda. All right, Senator Kupec, Senate File 2042.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is the Minnesota Schedule of Controlled Substance Modification. Senate File 2042 is to make permanent the Board of Pharmacy's scheduling order. There are 39 substances that the DEA has already placed into the federal schedule due to their abuse potential. The board worked to mirror this with a scheduling order in March 2022. However, the existing scheduling order expires on April 11th, 2023. The ramifications of not permanently scheduling the 39 substances involve public safety and law enforcement. If someone is arrested for the sale or possession of one of these substances, they will not be able to be charged in state courts if the substances aren't listed on the state schedules. So the bill before you has it's like going back to chemistry again in college, but there's a lot of things on it, and the changes are primarily located on pages 5, 12, and 17, where the substances have been added to the list.
Thank you, Senator Kupec. Members, for those who've been on the committee before, we see this kind of bill every year as the chemistry changes and different drugs hit the street, and we just have to update these statutes to reflect that. Any questions from members of the committee or discussion? Senator Kupec, we're not going to ask you or any member of the committee to pronounce most of the items that are being added to these schedules here today.
That would be
maybe
good.
You've got a science background, you'd be in a better position.
Yeah, if it was
than most of
atmospheric
us.
chemistry, maybe, but most of these are above my pay grade.
All right, Senator Uma Verbaeten moves that Senate File 2042 be recommended to pass and be re-referred to the Senate Health and Human Services Committee. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion prevails. Thank you, Senator Kupec.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, committee.
Senator Coleman has arrived in the room, I understand. Senator Coleman, come on forward. We're going to take up Senate File 733. First committee. Yes. Members, the Senate file has been distributed to the committee. There's an A1 amendment. This is the first committee stop for this bill. So Senator Uma Verbaeten moves adoption of the A1 amendment as an author's amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion prevails. The amendment is adopted. Senator Coleman, tell us about your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. In 2019, then Hennepin County Attorney Mike Freeman was asked why his county hasn't had a single prosecution under the state's straw purchase law. His response was the penalty was too low. According to the Department of Justice, after illegal black market transfers, straw purchases are the most common way that a criminal acquires a firearm. A violation of Minnesota's straw purchase law happens when somebody acquires a firearm for an ineligible person, knowing that that person is ineligible to possess a firearm. A background check is being done for the sale of the firearm, but not on the individual who will actually own it. There have been several recent high-profile prosecutions of firearm traffickers who were engaging in straw purchases, but all of those traffickers are being prosecuted under federal law. Hennepin County Attorney Mike Freeman testified, Minnesota's law is exceptionally weak. This bill seeks to fix that. With law enforcement resources stretched thin and prosecutors overwhelmed with heavy caseloads, they must make tough decisions about the allocation of their resources. By raising the penalty for this crime to a felony, I believe we will send a strong message to our prosecutors and law enforcement that the legislature intends for these crimes to be taken seriously and that the penalty will be worth their time in investigation and prosecution. This, I believe, is a common sense measure that we should all get behind. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Coleman. We do have identified as potential witnesses Brian Peters or Reed LeBeau. Either of you present or wish to be heard at this time? Not seeing anyone come forward. Is there any question or comment from members of the committee on this bill? Senator Cruin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a comment. I'm a co-author on this bill. I think it's a great bill. It is a very common way for people that shouldn't have guns to obtain guns. And if we're going to get serious about gun violence, this is a key component to that. So I strongly support this bill. Thanks.
Any further question or comment from members of the committee? And Senator Cruin, being a co-author in the bill, moves that Senate File 733 as amended be recommended to pass and be re-referred to the Senate Finance Committee. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion prevails. Thank you, Senator Coleman. Can't see if Senator Swadzinski's in the room. Not present at this time. Back to All right, Senator Pappas, are you ready on 1972? Yeah. So Senate File 1972 is before us now. We have a fairly lengthy list of testifiers. I don't know how much of the testimony that is being proposed is going to be overlapping with other testifiers. So in the interests of committee efficiency, I will ask that if you have something to say that has already been said or will be said that you know of, you can either be very, very quick or pass on your opportunity to testify. I'm not going to limit the public testimony except to those who are on our list, of course. But in any case, please, 2 minutes max, and then we'll have time for the committee to discuss it, and you can answer questions, of course, too. So we have before us Senate File 1972. This is the first stop for the bill. We have the A1 amendment before us. Senator Pappas moves adoption of the A1 amendment as an author's amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion prevails. The amendment is adopted. Senator Pappas, tell us about your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Assistant Attorney Walker, who is up here with me, has to leave very shortly. So I would like her to give her testimony because she does explain the bill and just cut out my opening comments in the interest of time.
Perfect. Ms. Walter, go ahead.
Senator Pappas, Chair Latz, members. My name, sorry, it was misprinted on your agenda. I'm Sarah Davis. I'm here with the Hennepin County Attorney's Office. No problem. And I am the director of our Children and Families Division at the Hennepin County Attorney's Office, where I oversee our office's work related to youth, including youth prosecution, child protection, child support, and truancy intervention. I'm also an attorney with over 15 years of experience working with youth in the legal system. We are in the midst of an unprecedented mental health crisis for our youth. And these are urgent reforms within this provision to ensure that we're providing the care and support that our youth and communities need to be healthy and safe. So Senate File 1972 does a couple of things that are really critical to our efforts at community safety in Hennepin County. Number one is it restricts visual strip searches. Visual strip searches, what we're talking about here is unclothed searches of children as young as 10 years old, exposing their breast, buttocks, and genitalia. And this is deeply traumatizing. All research has clearly demonstrated that this increases and exacerbates mental health concerns, including but not limited to anxiety, depression, sleep disturbances, self-harm, and suicide. We also know that upwards of 65% of the young women who enter our youth justice system are victims or survivors of abuse, and that LGBTQ+ youth are significantly overrepresented in our justice system, which just heightens the risk of traumatization. This provision does not prohibit strip searches. I want to be clear about that. Instead, it simply imposes important restrictions to ensure it's only used when necessary and that it's done by a trained person. Less invasive, evidence-based practices for locating contraband are still allowed, including non-visual strip searches. And I want to be clear, 90+% of our licensed youth facilities in the state are already in compliance with this. We also know that facilities have the capacity to use medically trained individuals because they already are required to do so for cavity searches. There's broad agreement that this change needs to happen, including an American Bar Association resolution from 2020. In the interest of time, I'm going to turn to the second half of this bill, which addresses solitary confinement for children. This provision would eliminate the use of solitary confinement for children in licensed facilities in Minnesota. So solitary confinement, which is the use of isolation as punishment, is a fundamental human rights violation, and 23 other states have banned or significantly limited this practice. Minnesota is not one of them. Currently, this is allowed under Minnesota law and administrative rules where it's called disciplinary room time. Solitary confinement of children is deeply harmful, leading to psychosis, anxiety, self-harm, and suicide. In fact, national research has shown that more than half of suicides in youth facilities occur when the youth is in isolation. A recent CARE 11 investigation found that in Hennepin County alone, children were placed in solitary confinement for 24 hours or more at a time, over 3,380 times. Imagine if this was your child and you isolated your child as punishment for over 24 hours. CPS and law enforcement would be at your door. It's also really important to know we don't need to do this because we have a tool called seclusion, which is in the rules, which is there for instances when an immediate safety intervention is necessary. It's different in that it can't be used as punishment, which is solitary confinement or sanction, but it can be used to keep everybody safe. And so what we're asking through this legislation is that we eliminate the practice of solitary confinement, this human rights violation, and that we limit the use of visual strip searches on children. Again, children as young as 10 years old. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. So next on our testifier list is Chantel Allen, if you'd come forward, and also Maya Burrell, if you would come forward and take one of the other vacant testifier seats. And go ahead and introduce yourself, please, and please keep your testimony to 2 minutes. Appreciate you being here today.
What's happening, y'all? I'm Chantel Allen. I am the Director of Criminal Justice Policy and Activism with Wayfinder Foundation. I'm also on the St. Paul School Board. I just really want to be brief because I feel like the last presenter kind of hit it over the head. I brought my colleague, Maya Burrell, to speak to this situation from a personal aspect, but I just want to speak to it as someone who works with students I do a lot of street outreach. I'm a EBD level 4, 5, and 6 specialist when I worked in education. And so the demographics that we're talking about are young people that I work with on a regular basis, and I'm constantly trying to move towards success. I just want to say that, you know, I want to speak to the second half of it, most importantly. In 2016, Obama said he banned the use of solitary confinement in juvenile facilities, and as the lady said before us, there's quite a few states who have banned it also. I just am really disappointed that our state is so far behind. When we think about some of the issues that we're dealing with in the streets, I mean, this isn't the only committee that you guys sit on, and so you see these things kind of overlapping in all different areas, and abuse like this, it contributes to that tremendously. Adverse childhood trauma does not just happen from your parents. That happens from any caregiver or anybody who is responsible for a child. And whether they've committed a crime and they're in a juvenile justice space, we as adults are still responsible for young people in this state. And so I just want to urge you to move this bill, because we have to do better. And as a Minnesotan, I'm a fourth generation Rondo kid. You know what I'm saying? I just would hope that those of us that are in elected positions would really start to do better so that we can start to see better things. And so I just want to introduce my colleague, Mayan Burrell, to talk about his experience in solitary confinement when he was a juvenile.
Thank you, Ms. Allen. Before Mr. Burrell begins, Ms. Allen, if you could return to the seat in the audience, and we'll invite Lola Johnson to come forward and take the testifier's seat.
Cool.
Thank you very much for your testimony today. Ms. Johnson, come on forward. Are you David Benke?
Yes, sir.
All right, then you can take the seat, please, and we'll hear from Mr. Burrell. Go ahead, sir. Welcome to the committee.
Yeah, thanks for having me. My name is Mayan Burrell. I'm a criminal justice advocate for the Wayfinder Foundation. I'm also a formerly incarcerated individual who's locked up and entered the criminal justice system as a juvenile. Like my colleague said, I spent a lot of time in solitary confinement as a juvenile. And first of all, I just want to testify to the fact that these are kids that we're talking about. So these are our children that we're talking about. And a lot of times we lose sight of that when they enter these systems. So I could start off speaking to as far as when she was speaking about the strip searches and how dehumanizing that is. Even as an adult, for you to have to go through that process, but for a child to have to go through that process, it's almost as if you're having something taken from you at that time, and you never really get that back. That you become desensitized to people viewing you as an object, or for people to even have the authority to be able to tell you things that a lot of individuals never experienced in life. And so just thinking about that, thinking about your child having to endure that warrantedly, I could understand if there was no other option besides taking somebody through that process. But for you to have an opportunity to do something other and you choose to belittle or dehumanize a child, to me, it just seems absurd. And then not understanding the fact that these children are going to return back to society. And so they go into the system as a child and they come out as a whole different individual because they've been dehumanized. And so they come home desensitized. As far as solitary confinement, I was in prison at the age of 16 in an adult facility. So I went to Hennepin County Jail at the age of 16. I spent more than 18 years of my life in prison. Like I said, as a youth, I spent the majority of my youth years in prison, my childhood. But initially going into the system, I was put in solitary confinement and it was justified by saying that I was basically being separated from population for my own protection. But at the time, they actually had units that were specifically for certified juveniles. But with me, I was isolated. So I experienced that initially just straight out the gate going into the criminal justice system as far as solitary confinement. And the first thing that registered to me going into that place is that the people around me were dealing with mental health issues. And so for me, there had never been subjected or never been exposed to these things, and hearing grown men crying or yelling or talking to themselves or smearing feces on their windows, you know what I mean, and for a child to go in there, it's an extremely traumatic experience, and it's forever be lodged in your brain. And so for me to think about that as a punishment for a child is just it's heartbreaking. Because I would think that if a child was acting out, that you would bring somebody into that child's life that could help instead of separate that child from the rest of humanity. And that's what actually happens, is that and sometimes you even develop an antisocial personality to where if you anything happens, traumatic or whatever, the first thing you do is you go into seclusion and you isolate yourself. And this is something that's a psychological effect of being separated from other human beings at such an early age, and especially for long periods of time. So I'm here to testify that like I do want this bill to pass. I feel like if as a human being, if you remove yourself from the policy, if you remove yourself from the legality, if you remove yourself from the law, and you look at the fact that these are children that we're talking about, and you think about taking your child and putting them in a bathroom and tell them that that's where they're going to be for 1 day, 2 days. They come out and they might be able to use a telephone for an hour, or get in a shower, take a shower, you know what I mean? And think about what would be the effects of that on your child. So and that's what I wanted to testify today. I hope that y'all hear me. I appreciate y'all having me.
Thank you, Mr. Burrell. Appreciate your testimony here today.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm going to ask you to go ahead and have a seat back in the audience. I don't know if Lola Johnson is here yet, but if not, then we'll ask Malaika Iban to come forward to take the empty testifier seat. And Mr. Benke, go ahead. 2 minutes, please.
Totally. Senators, it's good to be back here to talk about ending solitary confinement and strip searches for juveniles today and for adults tomorrow. It's taken me a long time to understand the importance of abuse and sexual violence. I was raised believing that adults and family members and government employees were safe. And I've had to learn that that's not the case. I've learned that from partners, I've learned that from friends, and I've learned that this year when 5 different women in Shakopee Prison called me and reported sexual assault by staff in that facility. If this is going on with adults, what is happening to our children? These assaults have taught me a number of things that I think are important to understand for how we respond to this issue and why I support this bill. First, by any measure, strip searches are a form of sexual assault, and solitary confinement is a form of abuse. There's 3 decades of history of harassment, assault, and intimidation at Shakopee Prison, and similarly with a lot of these other facilities. You can see that in your attached documents. The DOC has not been a strong ally on this issue, and that's what we're thinking about in terms of how we craft legislation and build moving forward. Retaliation for reporting remains normal and expected. Shakopee has refused for 3 years to use a body scanner, which would allow them to not use strip searches in the facility, despite purchasing it for that purpose under this administration. And the scanner is still hardly used, despite ongoing protests from the Task Force on Incarcerated Women and Girls and others. Finally, it taught me about something very important called the sexual assault to prison pipeline, which is that being sexually assaulted is a key reason that many, many of our people end up in prison, including people in juvenile facilities. I've personally talked to women in Shakopee Prison who were strip searched while unconscious before put in an ambulance, who were strip searched prior and after a surgery and could barely move, to people who refuse visits and therefore cut themselves off from their loved ones because they don't want to deal with the trauma of being strip searched that will put them in a place for days or weeks or months. I've heard of lesbian guards bragging about strip searching people and not having any consequence when it's reported. And you probably know of guards who covered up sexual assault at Shakopee Prison and were then rehired after being fired through union arbitration. So this is the status quo today around sexual assault in our facilities. In your attachments, you'll find a description of being strip searched by a woman in Shakopee Prison. I hope Lola gets here so she can tell you some of her experience in that place. And then finally, if we're against sexual assault and abuse anyway, we need to be against them everywhere. So please support this bill. And thank you for what you do, yeah.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Benke. I'm going to ask you to return to your seat, please, and we'll invite Matt Bauer to come forward to the empty testifier seat. Ms. Eban, go ahead and introduce yourself, your affiliation, and present your testimony. 2 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Senator Latz. Thank you, Senator Pappas and committee members. My name is Malika Eban, and I'm the Interim Executive Director at the Legal Rights Center in Minneapolis, and also a member of the Minnesota Coalition for Youth Justice. I will keep my comments brief today, as much of what I want to share has been uplifted by previous testifiers. At the end of the day, what we're looking at is how our system meets its rehabilitative goals and how we treat young people in our care. Young people incarcerated across the state of Minnesota deserve the same well-being and treatment as the children in our homes, and therefore it is critical that we do the work today in this committee and in this legislative session to ensure that we are not torturing them by locking them in cells as a form of punishment, and that we are keeping them safe from the trauma of strip searches. Our organization and coalition works with young people across the state who feel really strongly about this bill, who have worked to educate their peers in the community, who know how important it is that their elected officials see them as young people who are deserving of care. And so I urge you and appreciate your support today on Senate File 1972. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Eban, for your testimony. As you vacate your seat, if Elliot Boutte is here, please come forward and take the empty seat at the table. Mr. Bauer, go ahead with your testimony. Introduce yourself and proceed. 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chairman Latz and members of the committee. Good afternoon. My name is Matt Bauer. I'm the superintendent at the Dakota County Juvenile Services Center. I co-chair the Juvenile Justice Advisory Committee Mental Health Committee. And I'm representing the Minnesota Association of Community Corrections Act Counties, which is MACAC, and the Minnesota Juvenile Detention Association, MNJDA, at today's hearing. I have nearly 30 years' experience working with youth in juvenile justice facilities. The Minnesota Juvenile Detention Association serves youth with the highest risk and needs. These are the youth that have nowhere else to go in Minnesota and have been determined by the courts to be unsafe in our communities. We are committed to providing these youth with our best services, including providing them an opportunity to be the best they can be. We cannot do this in an unsafe setting. We thank Senator Pappas for the recent revision to this bill, which may allow us to partner with the Minnesota Department of Corrections on a revision of licensing rules around the use of room time. We have made great strides to meet the growing mental health and trauma needs of our youth, while all other programs, or most other programs, in our state have disappeared over the last few years. We ask for an opportunity to partner with the Minnesota Department of Corrections to update the licensing standards around room time so we can provide a safe environment for youth to become the best they can be. On behalf of MACAC and MNJDA, I thank you. We very clearly support reform around the use of room time. As practitioners and subject matter experts, we need to be involved in that reform and have a voice at that table. I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Bauer. Our final testifier, then Elliot Boutte. Go ahead, 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair Latz, members. My name is Elliot Boutte with NAMI, Minnesota. We support this bill and promoting trauma-informed practices for our youth. One way we like to think about trauma-informed practices is, instead of asking what's wrong with you, we ask what happened to you. I want to add a little bit to what Sarah Davis said about a disciplinary room time and the alternatives. The administrative rules for all residential children facilities in our state have clear requirements for seclusion and restraints. In addition to what Sarah said, that they should only be used in safety emergencies and they have to end when the threat ends, they also have to be overseen by a mental health professional or program administrator. Staff have to receive training, and they have to provide detailed documentation after each incident. And there are no such guardrails for disciplinary room time. So I think it's important to note that we are not just removing something and replacing it with nothing when we ask to stop doing disciplinary room time. The rule around disciplinary room time is clear that it's a punishment for a rule violation, and that we will isolate children And it's very clearly contrasted with other forms of restraint and isolation that have safety precautions and considerations, and DRT just doesn't. We are empathetic to the detention facilities who are under-resourced. We know it will require resources for training, staff, and technology. But our simple response is that if we need more resources to end these practices, then this legislature must provide those resources. Finally, when we're talking about Minnesota's juvenile justice system, we're talking about disproportionately Black and Indigenous children. Right now, these policies show that we are okay asking some children, "What happened to you?" while we are still asking other children, "What's wrong with you?" And we need to change that. So we urge your support on this bill, and thank you for the chance to speak today.
Thank you, Mr. Buttai. That concludes our testimony. After the testifiers return to their seats, we'll open up the floor for conversation among members of the committee. Any questions or comments? Senator Limmer.
Senator Pappas, give me a timeline of when a juvenile detention facility would be employed. Is it at the time of an arrest of a juvenile? Does that juvenile individual get sent to a juvenile facility, detention facility immediately, or would they go to a jail?
Senator Pappas.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Limmer, I think it'd be good if we could get someone from DOC to answer that. I think Mr. Curtis is here, or the commissioner.
Commissioner Schnell, come on forward.
Mr. Chair, Senator Limmer, they would typically go to a juvenile detention center immediately following arrest.
So, Mr.
Senator
Chair, Commissioner, at the point of an arrest, the first formal location would be in a juvenile detention center, and then they would await an arraignment. Is that how the process works?
Commissioner Schnell.
Mr. Chair, Senator Limmer, that typically would be the case.
Yeah.
Senator Limmer.
I've heard, I listened carefully to the testifiers. Being a former correction officer, there's always a concern for safety. And I didn't hear anyone from the testifier standpoint really mentioning much about safety other than some of the provisions that are recognized in the A1 amendment. But in the practice that I was involved in, every transfer from whether it was well, I didn't work with juveniles, but every place before and after a court decision was made, there would be a search of that individual for this because of the safety for staff and other inmates. And the scanner device that has been mentioned, we didn't have those things back in the day. But do they pick up, do they detect drugs? Do they detect metal? Do they detect plastic weapons? Things like that? I'm not familiar with that equipment. Could you maybe reflect that?
Commissioner Schnell.
Mr. Chair, Senator Limmer, yes, those devices are able to detect a wide array of different things. I will say that the use of body scanner technology in juvenile detention centers is prohibited. And this is grounded in federal guidance around exposing juveniles or pregnant women or so forth to body scanner technology, which is the reason they're not deployed in many of these settings. There certainly is a desire to. And the whole goal of this is to reduce the trauma associated with unclothed body searches. And I want to be clear that nothing would prohibit, and certainly would be anticipated and expected, that your typical PAT search, those things would still occur as it relates to transfer and those sorts of things when security concerns are noted.
Senator Limmer.
I'm done.
Nothing further? Any other discussion from members of the committee? I'm not seeing any. Senator Pappas, the next stop is state and local government. Senator Pappas moves that Senate File 1972 as amended be recommended to pass and be re-referred to the Senate Committee on State and Local Government. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion prevails. Thank you, Senator Pappas. Senator Swedzinski, why don't you come on forward? Senate File 1087, members, it's being distributed to you as we speak. And your testifier can come forward as well. Senator Swedzinski, I have two of them, actually, Leanne Renteria and Scott Borboom. If you would both please come forward, take your seats, and I'm going to ask you to limit your testimony to 2 minutes each after Senator Swedzinski introduces the bill. Senator, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, members. I do have the A2 amendment.
Members, this is an author's amendment. Senator Uma Verbatim moves to adopt the A2 amendment as an author's amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, motion prevails. The amendment is adopted. Senator Swedzinski.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair and members. This bill and the amendment basically gives some money. The first thing that's amended is from $25,000 to $75,000 because some stakeholders came up to me after the initial bill was written and said, this is going to be a really popular idea, and we could use a little bit more money to help more law enforcement officials. A couple years ago, Senator Howe and I firefighters reached out to us, and they started telling us about how our profession as firefighters we're supposed to be tough. And we don't clean our equipment because we're too tough. We don't need to have clean equipment. But we're human beings. We're members of we're Homo sapiens. We're just normal people when we go back home at the end of the day. So after listening to the firefighters, Senator Howe and I and others, we wrote the Hometown Heroes Act, and it's been a successful program, I hope, for many of our firefighters. Well, now I'm here before you with another idea, this time to help law enforcement because they're hurting as well. And along with nurses and teachers and everybody else that just went through the last couple of years of a hellacious experience, they're going through trauma and post-traumatic stress, and they're asking for our help. And so what this bill does is it creates a grant program for a school that is trained in helping our law enforcement officials get the help that they need. And this money would train 150 law enforcement officials that are seeking just to be made right again after their experiences trying to keep us safe. So with that said, I'd like to introduce the two testifiers.
Thank you, Senator Swedzinski. The first testifier on my list is Leanne Renteria. Welcome to the committee. Go ahead and introduce yourself and present your testimony. 2 minutes, please.
Mr. Chair and members, my name is Leanne Renteria. I currently work as a mental health practitioner in St. Paul. I'm here to speak on behalf of law enforcement officers who have struggled with mental health and wellness. All my life, I've been surrounded by police officers, including my grandfather, father, uncles, cousins, and friends. I became an officer, and I married one. I have clients who are police officers. Police officers see the worst of people and good people at their worst. No one walks away from police work unscathed. Growing up, I watched my father struggle with migraines. His heart would pound. He often thought he was having a heart attack. He worried a lot, and he isolated on his days off. He sought out several medical professionals, but he was continually told that his symptoms were in his head. He continued to suffer like this for most of his career until it eventually took his life. I took a great deal of pride in being a police officer. Like most, I found myself gravitating towards other officers in my free time. It's a challenge to find people who really understand what it is like to work in law enforcement. It was in police work that I met my husband. Shortly before our wedding, my husband was involved in a fatal car accident on the job. Our lives were changed forever. At first, we tried to power through it, but eventually our mental health suffered. We were referred to counseling, but weren't ready to accept the help. In police work, having a mental health issue is a sign of weakness. Officers are told to suck it up and get over it. Trauma is just part of the job. After a few months, we decided we were fine, and we stopped going to therapy. Then my husband lost his job, and we lost ourselves. We tried just about everything we could to cope, but it didn't matter. Our past traumas and the impact from the accident took a toll on our relationship. When we finally hit rock bottom, we had a 5-month-old girl. She's here to support me today. We wanted to do better for her. We went back to therapy, and this time we did what they told us to do. We trusted the counselors because they had extensive knowledge in police work and police families. As my mental health improved, so did my interactions with the citizens. I became a better person, but I became a better police officer. Police work is really hard. Most people don't understand what officers go through. When seeking support, most officers want professionals who understand police work and the mental health issues specific to that field. They need someone to be on their side. Most police officers have determination and integrity. They want to get better. Perhaps we need to focus on keeping the good officers we have and create a positive environment that will draw new recruits. I do what I do, and the work I do with police officers is for the officers like my dad and my husband and my friend who is one of the best officers I know who took his own life a few years ago. From my personal experience and from the work I do, I can tell you that we need more therapists trained to give professionals the support they need so in turn they can do their best work possible. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, officer, for your testimony. Appreciate you being here today. Chief Borboom, welcome to the committee.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and committee members. My name is Scott Borboom, and I'm the Chief of Police for the City of Minnetonka. Thank you for having me here today on this very important topic. As you're well aware, there's a lot of attention around law enforcement mental health, and we're all trying to identify strategies to better support our officers. As the Chief of Police in Minnetonka, I take officer wellness very seriously, and we have identified several strategies in Minnetonka to improve officer wellness. One in particular is our annual checkup from the neck up, which was started in 2022. Annually, all police staff, not just our sworn staff, are required to spend 1 hour with a therapist to do a check-in. Upon request by the employee, we will pay for an additional 12 sessions. We have budgeted $25,000 annually to contract with 2 therapists. When we researched the therapists to provide this service, we were surprised by the number of therapists with no experience working with law enforcement. And so that's an important part of the therapy is working with somebody who knows your experience. I do believe it's improving. However, there is still a need for more therapists trained in working with law enforcement. When approached by the Adler Graduate School, which is in Minnetonka, about this bill, I was pleased to see a focus on training additional therapists on the unique challenges a law enforcement officer faces. While this will certainly benefit the metro area, I believe it will have a greater impact on greater Minnesota police officers by providing more mental health professional resources in these areas. Training more therapists on the unique set of stressors our police officers face will provide more resources for those officers in need, and therefore I support this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Borboom. Okay, we'll ask the testifiers to go ahead and return to your seats. Thank you very much. That's all I have for our testifiers today. Any discussion from members of the committee? I will tell you the plan is to lay the bill over for possible inclusion in an omnibus bill. Any discussion? Senator Kroon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I guess this question was for the chief.
Chief, come on back.
Thank you. You mentioned in your testimony the neck up, check up, and I know that I think Senator Westland has a bill to that effect working its way somewhere through the system that would kind of take that model and make it statewide. So if I'm understanding your testimony correctly, this bill would complement that in terms of when something is identified in that checkup, it would provide better resources to specifically deal with the issues related to law enforcement. Am I getting that right?
Senator, that's a great question. And yes, that would. And an example is I had an officer who went through their primary health coverage looking for a therapist and was unable to locate someone with experience in law enforcement. In fact, it was about a month to get an appointment. And that was prior to having the checkup from the neck up. And so we just said, we'll cover it, and you go to our therapist, and you'll have an appointment the next day. So I do believe more therapists being available in the state would help those, not just through annual checkups from the neck up that we require, but just officers on their own, looking for someone to talk to. There would be more resources available to them if there were more therapists that were trained in what Adler can do for them.
Senator Kroon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I became familiar with that bill through a friend of mine who is in law enforcement suffering from PTSD. And so I think this is a very important issue, and it might take a multifaceted approach to solve it. And I think this is probably a good component to it. So thank you.
Any other questions or comments from members of the committee? I'm not seeing any, so Senate File 1087 is laid over for possible inclusion in the omnibus bill.
Thank you,
Senator
Chair, and
Swedzinski.
thank you, members. I just want to, Senator Pappas is one of her testifiers said, we need to stop asking what's wrong with you and start asking what happened to you, and I think this bill echoes that sentiment. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Members, we're going to take up Senate File 2380. It's the last bill we're going to be able to fit on today's agenda. I apologize to those of you who have appeared on other bills. We just don't have the time to get to them today. That means we will be taking them up for testimony on Friday. There is the availability to testify by Zoom at our committee hearings, so if you can't return on Friday, but you can make yourself available by Zoom, we will certainly include you then. Senator Seeberger's Senate File 2380. Members, the material has now been distributed to the committee. Supervision Standards Committee establishment. This is the first committee stop for this bill. I have two amendments before us. Why don't we just take them in order? Can't do two offers well, Senator Seeberger, I'll let you tell us. I've got an A3 and an A4 in my packet here. Do you intend to ask us to adopt both amendments or one of them?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I'm going to be asking that both be adopted, and I'll tell you why.
Go ahead.
Okay, so the A3 amendment has been offered by the counties, and the A4 amendment has been authored by the Department of Corrections, and the only reason they are not merged into one cohesive amendment is because of time. We just didn't get them drafted into one piece in time for that, but all the stakeholders are in agreement, and it represents, I think, a good outcome with regard to discussions among the parties.
So my understanding, Senator Seeberger, is that the A4 amendment is drafted to the A3 amendment, which is a delete everything amendment. So I think the best thing to do here is to combine this into one author's amendment. So Senator Seeberger, being a member of the committee, you can make the motion. Is it your desire to adopt the content of the A4 amendment into the A3 amendment?
That is my wish, Mr. Chair.
Okay, I think as the author of the amendment, you have that prerogative without us taking formal action on the A4 amendment. So, members, we will now hear Senator Seeberger's motion to adopt the A3 amendment as an author's amendment as reflecting the incorporation of the content of the A4 amendment in it as well. To the author's amendment, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion prevails. The amendment is adopted. Senator Seeberger.
Thank you, Mr.
We're going to move, unfortunately, probably more quickly than folks would like on this, but we do have members who have to get to other committees, and I'm glad to hear we have stakeholder agreement, so maybe this will smooth it along here. Senator Seeberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. This bill creates a new community supervision formula based on data from statewide workload study, and it has to do with probation, and it establishes a community supervision advisory committee that will ensure the ongoing collaboration between the state, counties, tribal governments, and other justice stakeholders, similar to the collaboration that has brought us to this legislation today. I'm extremely thankful for the leadership of the AMC, the hard work of the members of the Minnesota Association of Community Corrections Act Counties, Minnesota Association of County Probation Officers, and the DOC. There are some things that I think the parties are still fine-tuning, but I'm going to turn it over to my testifiers, and I also want to thank all the members, the county members who put so much time and effort into this, and I know that many counties from across the state are represented here today.
Commissioner Schnell. As briefly as you possibly can.
Yes, I'm going to make it very short, Mr. Chair. Members, Paul Schnell from the Department of Corrections. I just want to say thank you to Senator Seeberger for carrying this bill. I want to thank the counties for all of the work that has been put into this. As I mentioned on Monday, this has been at least a 40-year problem, and it is it is now the time to come up with a fix, and we believe that working together we can do that. There is some, as was mentioned, there are some slight differences that we are still working on as it relates to this. As I noted on Monday, there was a number of provisions in the governor's recommended budget that provided over $40 million for the 3 delivery systems in our state, provided funding for tribal nations for supervision and related correctional services, and also provided grant funding. We share a commitment to doing better community supervision and being able to provide those services in an equitable fashion across our state, because we know and believe it will result in better public safety outcomes. And I'm here today to speak in support of that. And we look forward to continuing to work on this together with county partners as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. If you go ahead and have a seat, then we got Kevin Anderson, Hennepin County Commissioner, is at the table. Commissioner Bigham, if you want to come forward, welcome our former Judiciary Committee member. Here's Senator Bigham back to this room. Commissioner Anderson, 2 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Chair Latz and members of the committee. I'm Hennepin County Commissioner Kevin Anderson. I'm here on behalf of the Association of Minnesota Counties, as this bill includes the top public safety priority for counties. In 2021, the Council of State Governments Justice Center collected data and connected probation stakeholders to provide policy and funding recommendations to improve the system in Minnesota. A bill with the recommendations was heard and passed in the House in 2022, but the bill was part of the Public Safety Omnibus Bill that did not pass. Last summer, the Association of Minnesota Counties took the lead on the project and created the Community Supervision Work Group to finish the work and fix a decades-old problem. The probation funding formula is complicated and has led to severe underfunding of one of the largest parts of Minnesota's criminal justice system. Minnesota is the last in the nation in general fund spending on corrections. This complicated system has led to variations in supervision practices, and the lack of investment in community supervision has resulted in inconsistencies and inequities across the state. This means recidivism rates, supervision outcomes, and access to treatment and supports vary dramatically by county and agency, especially when looking at outcomes by gender and race. Both counties and Department of Correction Field Services have been forced to choose programs and services based on the resources they have rather than what works best to create public safety in each community. SF 2380 represents years of work to create a path towards a better funding formula and additional appropriations. Equally important, this bill would provide significant policy changes to advance probation practices statewide. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair and committee, for hearing this bill today, and we ask for your ongoing support to get this bill over the finish line this year.
Thank you, Commissioner. If you could go ahead and have a seat, and then Senator Bigham. Commissioner Bigham, welcome back to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I did tell you and Lee Limmer last year, if this didn't get done last year, I'd be back. I'm back. So thank you.
That's why we waited, so we'd have an excuse to get you back here.
Yeah, and thank you so much to Senator Seeberger, who is showing a lot of leadership on this issue, and really the counties appreciate it. I'm here on behalf of the Association of Minnesota Counties and the Minnesota Inter-County Association. I'm Washington County Commissioner Carla Bigham. The funding proposal for Senate File 2803 represents a historic collaboration between state, counties, and other stakeholders. The formula has two primary components. It's a base funding for each county to provide, that will provide stability over time, and then a per capita distribution with factors in probation risk, safety needs, and other essential costs for doing business. Pretty much it just simplifies the legislative oversight of the probation system by consolidating the 3 separate pots of funding for the different delivery systems into one fund that then provides all the appropriations for the community supervision system statewide. The formula distributes funds equitably across the state, and if fully funded, which is key, will ensure probation services are effective and evidence-based. Bill also creates the Community Supervision Advisory Committee that is charged with creating the standards that I know were discussed in the past. It creates structure and ensures collaboration continues long into the future and gives counties and other stakeholders strong voice in the statewide probation system. We have worked over 2 years on this and on a solution really that has been outlined by Commissioner Anderson. I also, since I left, Madam Chair, I have met some new people, and I want to give a shout out to Scott County Commissioner Barb Weckman-Brecky, who is here today and has provided tremendous leadership on behalf of counties. But we've asked for advice and input from local experts, as well as data collection and analysis from the Council of State Governments, American Probation Parole Association as well. The $83 million appropriation in this bill is based on workload study by experts, shows a dire need for the increase in investment, and breaking news, as of yesterday, all 87 counties, Madam Chair, have passed a resolution supporting the new funding formula and increase in investment in probation. We thank you for your support. We thank you for your time today, and thank Senator Seeberger for her leadership. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Bigham. Carly Stark, if you could state your full name and title for the record and then begin your testimony when you're ready.
No. My name is Carly Stark from the Association of Minnesota Counties. I am here to answer questions, should there be any.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ms. Stark. We'll go to our next testifier then. On Zoom, Waniyetu Bald Eagle, please correct me in pronouncing your name. You can unmute, state your full name and record, or state your full name and title for the record, and then begin your testimony. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair Latz, Senator Seeberger, and members of the committee. I wrote a letter here today to convey my thoughts and make sure I stay in the allotted time slot. My name is Waniyetu Bald Eagle, Winnie for short. I am a strong Lakota Sioux woman who believes change is possible. I'm a person in long-term recovery. I'm a state-certified peer recovery specialist, currently reside in Montevideo. Every day I work with people in active addiction to recovery on probation, ISR, and child protection services. I attend their court hearings, safety team meetings, and help them find their strengths and personal goals. I provide peer support, resources, and advocacy with care and compassion, giving them hope, knowing they don't have to do this alone. I am also a convicted felon, still on supervision. I served 5 years in Shakopee Prison. The first time was released, violated my supervision, and was revoked for 2 years. I entered the CIP program, which started my road to change. I learned about myself and how to create structure in my life, but the real challenge came when I returned to the community. That's where the real work begins and where I really needed the most support. The majority of my past supervision experiences were like a cattle call system. Come in, give a UA, touch base, don't dig into anything too deep, and be on my way. I felt like a number, like I didn't matter. Intense supervised release was very structured, mainly accountability based. A big part of ISR is getting a job and having a set schedule every week. I got a full-time job at the sugar beet plant, became part of the union, worked hard 12-hour rotating shifts, got my locomotive operator's license. But as I spent more time adjusting to the community, the more I experienced real-world issues, struggles, and problems. Relationship issues, getting back with my family, reuniting with my children, making everyday decisions in a positive way. Luckily, I transferred my supervision to a rural agency where I was not treated like a number. For the first time, I felt people had the time to see me as an individual that helped ease the stigma. I felt like I mattered and human, that I could bring up problems and they would help me with them. That also gave me the confidence that I could be a better person. They believed in me, being able to succeed, not that I would simply fail. The agents that supervise me in 6WCC have the time on their caseloads to work with me individually, not like a revolving door. Time with my agent is what really matters. Time to work on goals, time to learn new ways of thinking and coping, getting new perspectives on my choices and practicing new skills. Sometimes your agent, just having that extra time to get to know an individual and invest in them as a person makes all the difference. I know others who have not succeeded on supervision, but good supervision can make all the difference, and it did for me. If they had the time and benefit with their agent that I have to learn and practice, I think they all could have succeeded as well. My supervision hasn't been perfect. I relapsed at one point. My father passed, and I was struggling. If I didn't have the good working relationship that I have with my agents, where there is care, compassion, and empathy, I probably would have been just another failing statistic. They had the time to help me work through my relapse, not just revoke my supervision. Every person on supervision around the state deserves equal access to the best care possible, to the same opportunities to succeed. I would ask that the committee fully fund supervision as needed because it works. It worked for me.
Thank you for your testimony. That concludes our testifiers. So committee members, questions, comments? Senator Limmer.
Madam Chair, are we planning on voting on this today, or is it going to be laid over?
Senator Limmer, we are planning to vote on it. I think we do need to vote on, do we need to vote on the amendments? Yes. And then it's going to go to state and local government and veterans.
All right, Madam Chair, as this has promised to consider, we started hearing this at 4 minutes to 3 o'clock. We've had nothing but testimony. We haven't gone through the bill page by page, and it's a delete everything, so there are definitely changes from the one I originally read in the last few days. And we also heard from the commissioner that there's still tweaks that have to be made to it. So I'm wondering if we have enough information to adequately and realistically give it our judgment of passage or not. Is this coming back to for a budget process? Could you tell me what the path is?
Yes, Senator Limmer. So after going to state and local government and veterans, it will come back to Judiciary and Public Safety.
And will that be for just a budget consideration, or will that be for a real discussion about policy, Madam Chair?
I mean, I think we should have a conversation today, and I will entertain the questions that committee members have, and Senator Seeberger and the testifiers waited a long time to be here to discuss the bill, and then, we'll have a motion, we'll take a vote. So I'd like to get into the discussion.
Well, Madam Chair, we're almost 45 minutes past our allotted time. How long do you think we will go? Some of us have other appointments.
We'll see what questions we have, Senator Limmer. Would you like to start?
Madam Chair. Let me get to my bill and then compare the delete everything to.
One question while you're.
Sure. Senator Kroon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Commissioner, you had mentioned that there are still tweaks that need to be done. Maybe you could come and elaborate on what is still being worked on?
Senator Seeberger. Commissioner Schnell.
Madam Chair, Senator Kroon, I think much of it is technical and will be related primarily to budgetary issues, not so much around policy matters.
Senator Kroon.
What was the question?
Senator Limmer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Senator Seeberger, as I've been looking at the bill, I was studying the original bill, not the delete everything bill. So can you explain to me the differences between both bills?
Senator Seeberger.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Senator Limmer, I'm going to hand this over to Ms. Stark, who can give you an overview of what the delete all does.
Ms. Stark.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Senator Limmer, the delete all is the language that the counties had hoped to be in this bill. There was some placeholder language in the original that talked about a formula created by the AMC Community Supervision Work Group. The reason that was in the original was because we were still waiting on that data from the statewide workload study in order to inform the new formula, which we did just as soon as possible. Usually that process takes over a year, and we collected the data, came up with it in approximately 6 months. So what is in the delete all is the new formula, which has a base for each county that grows over time. It provides stability and creates funding that's not tied to probation population. And then it has a capitated rate, or we usually call it a per diem in Minnesota, which was determined using average risk levels across the probation population, and recommended caseload sizes that came from that workload study, and came from we had a subcommittee of probation experts working on this. It also creates the Community Supervision Advisory Committee, which will gather and report data, develop statewide training, coaching, and quality assurance system. And the quality assurance and statewide training, that was a recommendation from the Council of State Governments to kind of make sure that when we are having trainings and using evidence-based practices, that they are actually being implemented with fidelity to the evidence. Basically, if you are implementing them based on the evidence, that is when you get the best benefit of probation, and recidivism rates should go down. So some of the inconsistent funding has led to counties who are trying to implement evidence-based practices but are unable to because they don't have the resources. Another thing that it includes is a targeted innovation fund. That is supposed to be a grant fund for pilot projects, sort of like the Alternatives to Incarceration program, which I believe you heard a bill on that related to Mower County maybe last week or this week. I don't understand time at this time of year. There are also a couple of provisions, which are the ones we are still working on, that were added in the House, and we left them in there to sort of keep working on them as we go, related to revocation of probation for a list of delineated violations, and then supervision fees.
Senator Limmer.
Ms. Stark, were you a part of the discussion or a witness to the discussion in the other body?
Ms. Stark.
Madam Chair, Senator Limmer, yes.
Can you tell me
Senator Limmer.
how many minutes they gave to this bill?
Ms. Stark.
Madam Chair, Senator Limmer, I believe it was about 20 to 25. I was not tracking the time.
All right.
Senator Limmer.
I'd like to ask a few specific questions. If you can turn to page 11. Now, I'm on the A3 amendment. We're going in a new direction on this bill to include tribal governments. So could someone explain the need for us to intervene in tribal governments? We haven't done that before. Criminal courts that, with cases that originate in a tribal community, usually are almost always conducted in a Minnesota court rather than a tribal court. So if the system is still in a Minnesota court criminal justice system, why are we now recognizing tribal governments outside of that state government entity?
Commissioner Schnell.
Madam Chair, Senator Limmer, I would just say that we had a robust conversations with tribal leaders and tribal governments across the state. I think there has been lots of robust discussion even with among the counties group, and recognition of the fact that that Native Americans have not fared well in our system. And there is some some sound evidence that providing more culturally competent services, connecting people back to their communities, is one of the important features. And so what this does effectively would allow tribal governments to have a role in either directly in supervision or to be able to access some funding to support those services being delivered in their communities in a culturally competent sort of way.
Senator
Madam
Limmer.
Chair, Commissioner, that can't be done now?
Commissioner Schnell.
Madam Chair, Senator Limmer, it can be done, and in some cases it is, but the reality is that many of the tribes feel as though there is a disconnection. And what we've seen in some pilots that we're doing is that when we can increase the levels of services and supports, so accountabilities and supports, and have the tribes have a more active role in that the outcomes improve. We have a pilot project that we're just working on with in White Earth, and that has shown some significant benefit to people who are on supervision. And I think it is important and valuable that the tribes have a role at this table, especially when, again, you look at the outcomes.
Senator Limmer.
One other question, Commissioner, on page 11, starting on the paragraph on line 29. It talks about the Commissioner of Corrections specifically on lines 30. Looks like new language. I'll try and put it into context. If a county or tribal government withdraws from the subsidy program as outlined in subdivision 1 and asks the Commissioner of Corrections or the legislature mandates the Commissioner of Corrections to furnish probation services to the county, the probation officers, and other employees, displaced shall be employed by the Commissioner of Corrections at no loss of salary. I'm trying to understand, does this give the Commissioner of Corrections added authority in this particular event?
Commissioner Schnell.
Madam Chair, Senator Limmer, no additional authority. What it does is it provides a level of protections when a county would choose to switch, a county or a tribal government would choose to switch a delivery system process. That's all this does, is ensures some stability for those employees. That is, I would remind you, it isn't currently in state law when counties make a switch to the state, that the state would assume some of those employees from a county if there was a different delivery system operating there. So this really provides a level of reciprocity.
Senator Limmer.
Elsewhere in the bill, in the repealers, this bill repeals the older provision that the state really has not ever lived up to, and that's payment for 50% of the probation cost for counties. And I understand there's a formula that's been accepted by different county organizations. And I'm just a little, I would like to hear from the counties. Maybe Ms. Stark could give us an indication. How confident are you that this formula will do better than the promise that the legislature made in years past?
Ms. Stark.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Senator Limmer, we are more confident in this formula. So that 50% statute only applied to county probation officer counties, which I think is at about 10 to 11% of the probation population. That's who they supervise. There was legislative intent when the Community Corrections Act went into place that it would be a cost share between state and county, but it wasn't spelled out as much in the statutes. This formula is based on, It lays out a capitated rate for how much it actually costs to fund probation. It actually accounts for that 50% going back to counties of misdemeanors, and instead of it just being counties that choose to contract with the Department of Corrections or be in the CPO model, it gives that 50% reimbursement to all counties because the statute did not allow for that kind of reimbursement of half the misdemeanors for any of the Community Corrections Act counties. So that is, you will see that on, I'm not exactly sure which line it is, but if you see the 50% or the per diem for gross misdemeanors, juveniles, and misdemeanors is half the amount of felonies, that accounts for that 50% reimbursement of misdemeanors from the state. And another thing in the bill that we feel is better is that it mandates that the Department of Corrections uses the formula for their budget recommendations, meaning they will say this is what the formula comes up with. This is the amount that is necessary per this formula that is in statute. So it sort of forces some of that collaboration. Now, we all know in the legislative process, there are negotiations throughout, but we are confident that if there is a starting number based on data, that will be good for counties, as well as the voice that counties will have on the Community Supervision Advisory Committee, which currently the Department of Corrections has a lot of authority to make policies, and under different administrations, there's more collaboration or less collaboration. Depending on who the commissioner is. We are fortunate that we have had a lot of collaboration with Commissioner Schnell on this proposal and many others, but that's not always been the case in the past. So having that voice on the advisory committee and the requirement that the commissioner respond to any recommendations from that committee, we believe gives counties more of a voice in the policy setting process going forward than we've had previously.
Senator Limmer?
Madam Chair, on line 18.8, there's a reference of a felony per diem rate. That's referenced at $5.33 multiplied by the sum of the county's adult felony population. Whenever we put a dollar amount into a statute, we commit ourselves to visiting this legislation almost on a yearly basis because inflationary rate changes the value of that $5.33. And so I don't know if there was a different formula for something like that. Was that discussed so we would avoid this repetition by the legislature?
Ms. Stark?
Madam Chair, Senator Limmer, we have it written into the bill that the workload study that was completed this year will be redone. And that was intentional because we know that probation populations change and how much it costs to supervise people changes. But we also put a couple of protections in there for the interim years. So first we have one that would be redone within the next 2 years. And then right now it says that it would be redone or completed every 6 years after that to update the capitated rate. But in the meantime, there is a clause that allows for automatic inflation, which is somewhat similar to the county program aid statute. So it basically says it will be no less than 2.5% or greater than 5%. And it's tied to, I think, a federal index.
Senator Limmer?
I understand that on page 21, lines 9, there's a statement that says violations where policies favor continued rehabilitation. I would interpret that as a purpose statement that we rarely, if ever, put in statute. So I would consider that to be unnecessary. But if we're going to meet again, we can address that perhaps later. I've got other definitional questions to ask. I've got a very important meeting that I have to go to. I had hoped that we would have had full committee discussion on this. Based on the long list of things we had to do today on our agenda, we didn't quite get to it. This is major policy discussion. One thing I did want to add is, I know that Commissioner Anderson made a comment about how Minnesota is the least in the 50 states that have less correction dollars spent to it. But keep in mind, everyone, that Minnesota is one of the least in incarcerating people, and there is a huge expense on that that kind of makes Minnesota an outlier. And if you would compare other states with that low incarceration rate, if we could find too many of those states, we might be in a little better position on the ranking. But just wanted to use that as a warning to us in using those kind of flash numbers, because Minnesota is an outlier based on about a 40-year history of not relying on incarceration. We rely more on probation. So having said that, I'll hold my other questions until hopefully a later time where we can have a more vigorous discussion on this.
Thank you, Senator Limmer. Senator Howe.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I guess my question is on page 2 of the A3 amendment, at line 226, it looks like we take out all the community work service. Is that not even a thing anymore? We eliminated it all, or is it somewhere else in the bill?
Ms. Stark.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Senator Howe. That is actually just moved. So there's another part in the bill where it is added back in. It's part of the sort of cleanup because we've got different statutes for different delivery systems. So we have the 401 chapter.
So, Madam Chair.
Senator Howe.
Can you explain to me where I can find it in the bill? And I think that's the problem that we're having. We should have probably staff walk us through the bill so we know whether it's in the A3 or the A4. It would help a great deal to understand where everything is, because right now, I'd be interested to see where this thing has been moved to, and I think there's other sections that are completely deleted that are moved somewhere else, and it's tough when we get it just on our desks today to try and understand where it all moved.
Thank you, Senator Howe. I'll give Ms. Stark a moment to locate that. I will just note that, this community supervision work group has spent an enormous amount of time working on this. This was one of the first meetings I had when I came to the legislature. Ms. Stark reached out right away. I think she made an effort to connect with all of the members of the Judiciary Committee. We heard, I'm still going. Commissioner Bigham pointed out all the counties that have provided that support. I think they've been reaching out to legislators as well. It's my understanding that there's some technical amendments here and there's things that need to be moved around. This is why we're trying to simplify this process. I hear that. I want to make sure we have time to answer these questions. We'll continue to go through it. We'll go to state and local government, and we'll still come back here for us to have time for more questions.
Well, Madam Chair, if they talk to everyone on the committee, I didn't get talked to on the committee. Not on these amendments. We might have a discussion, but I don't think we had all this discussion. We did have a discussion. I remember having the discussion. But these are brand new. I've never seen them before. And I remember I think in Commerce, Senator Latz ran me through the ringer because I offered some amendments to some bills without the author seeing them before. Well, it's great that the author's seen these before, but the rest of us that need to vote on this, it's kind of tough. So if you've got that section where this thing moved to, we'll go from there.
Ms. Stark.
Madam Chair, Senator Howe, I know it's in there because I had this conversation earlier this week. I am having trouble locating it, but I do know it is in there.
Senator Howe.
Can the author help us?
Senator Seeberger.
Madam Chair, Senator Howe, I am not familiar with where it is. We can certainly find it, let you know. I'm relying a lot on the expertise of the stakeholders who are involved in these conversations. I honor their conversations and the results that they came up with.
Mr. Turner.
Madam Chair, Senator Howe. The language deleted in section 1 is not reinstated in the bill. However, what Ms. Stark was speaking about was there's language regarding intermediate sanctions that's deleted in section 12 that's reinstated in section 7. But the language regarding conditional release here is not reinstated elsewhere in the bill. I, for one, I don't know why it's deleted. I was told it was obsolete language. That may be very well true. But I do not know the answer to section 1.
Senator Howe.
Well, that to me is a big concern if our folks from the counties believe was relocated and staff is telling us it's not in there. I've got real concerns with that, and I'm not sure what the committee wants to do with that, but I guess I've got another question on line 13.19. When we talk about the conditional release, we talk about must have a reasonable belief. What is reasonable belief? I couldn't find a definition section anywhere, so is there a statutory definition of reasonable belief, or what is that in order to prevent a person from escaping or absconding from supervision?
Commissioner Schnell.
Madam Chair, Senator Howe, this really just speaks to the fact that in order to, speaks to the authority for people to be able to issue warrants or have an arrest, a pickup made, that the person, the agent or their would have to have a reasonable belief that an order is necessary. That's what they would have to articulate, a reasonable belief, a set of facts that would justify the issuance of this warrant.
Senator Howe.
Madam Chair, so am I to believe we don't, is that written anywhere? Do we have a statutory definition of reasonable belief, or does every officer get to make that up on the fly?
Commissioner Schnell.
Madam Chair, Senator Howe, the issue around reasonable belief, remember that there's a difference here in terms of these are folks that are subject to community supervision. And the agent would need to be in a place where they can articulate a set of facts that ultimately would allow for the issuance of that apprehension and detention order, which we empower them to do, or to seek or secure a warrant for a person who is subject to release.
I'm going to go to Ms. Stark or Senator Seeberger.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Going back to the prior question with regard to where did the language in 2.26 and following end up, it is, if you go to page 8, it begins on line 8.21. And that provision, that's where it has been relocated.
No.
And I've been going through it line by line. It is the language.
Mr. Turner?
Madam Chair, it's my understanding that line 8.21 regarding intermediate sanctions is a reinstatement from section 12 in the bill, where if you'll see on line 12.20, that's the intermediate sanctions is deleted in that section of law and then moved over into section 7. So intermediate sanctions is deleted in one place and reinstated in the other. Section 1, and it may be very innocent regarding portions, not all, we don't delete conditional release, we delete a portion of that, of the conditional release statute. That is not reinstated in the bill, but there may be a good reason for why it's deleted. It's not deleting the entire conditional release statute, 243.05, it's just deleting paragraphs H through H and I. And if someone could come up with that, why that deletion is, maybe you would feel more comfortable, Senator.
I'm going to go to Senator Seeberger.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Stark is prepared to answer that.
Ms. Stark.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Senator Howe, I'm happy to go through this with you. My understanding of that is that it's somewhat of a consolidation, because as I was saying, there are 3 different delivery systems, and they're all housed under 3 different statutes. So part of this is trying to make sure there aren't 3 references to the same language in different parts. So the language on page 2 and the intermediate sanction language that's moved, all of the language is identical, and so it's kind of a consolidation, especially since we are doing a lot more cross-referencing related to the formula. But I'm happy to meet with anyone to talk more about the specifics as we go through session.
Senator Howe.
Thank you, Madam Chair, but it would have been great to have a walkthrough. It would have been great to have a discussion exactly how this all happened before we have to vote on a bill and move it out of committee. Thank you.
Okay, final comments, Senator Seeberger.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Again, I want to acknowledge all the hard work and the hours of work that went into this. This is an important bill, and I would move that this be recommended to pass and referred to the State and Local Government and Veterans Committee.
Madam Chair?
Thank you, Senator Seeberger. As amended.
As amended.
Madam Chair,
Senator Kroon.
I would amend the motion to pass it to state to that committee without recommendation, just given all the confusion that we see here, the late notice we got to delete all. We can still move it, but I'm not comfortable voting on this.
Senator Seeberger. So the motion would instead be to move Senate File 2380 without recommendation to state and local government and veterans. That's the difference. As amended, I apologize.
That's fine.
Okay. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay. The motion passes. That is our final bill we're taking up today. Thank you all for being very patient with us. We will be back on Friday for a long day. And with that, we're adjourned.